London, England. A vibrant financial centre where steel and glass palaces rise from the banks of the River Thames, which winds through the bustling capital city that 8 million people call home.
A massive fire right now in a West London tower block. We'll speak to our reporter live at the scene. The London Fire Brigade right now are dealing with a serious fire in a tower block, Grenfell Tower, 23-storey residential block of flats in Kensington.
On the 14th of June 2017, just before 1 a.m, a fire broke out inside apartment 16 on the 4th floor of a 23-storey high-rise tower block in West London known as the Grenfell Tower. Within 20 minutes, the whole building was ablaze. The building materials and cladding used in a controversial renovation burnt like a match. 72 people died in the catastrophe.
We're stuck on the 23rd floor! Hello!
When I saw the fire, I said, bloody hell, now the fire is, that's when, I got a bit more nervous.
The cladding system on Grenfell was such that once it had caught fire, that building was going to go up, I think, like a tinderbox. But that didn't mean that the people in it had to die.
The Grenfell Tower fire was the worst peacetime residential fire in London for 100 years. An extraordinary number of events led to the disaster and subsequent high death toll. A public inquiry is underway, and much has been revealed about the dynamics of what went wrong that night. And yet hundreds of buildings are still at risk of a similar fire wherever private interests eat away at social housing to maximize profits at the cost of lives.
Fire Brigade.
Yeah, hello, hi, in the fire, flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Sorry, a fire where?
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Within 6 minutes of the call from the Ethiopian-born taxi driver in whose flat the fire began, the first responders were on the scene at the Grenfell Tower residential block in the London borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They thought they had put out the fire, but as these thermal images show, burning material was dripping from the cladding panel outside the window. To the surprise of the firemen on scene, the fire swept upwards from flat 16 to the roof of the tower in a mere 20 minutes, trapping hundreds of people in this remodeled relic of the 1970s. Antonio Roncolato was in his flat on the 10th floor when he was awoken at about 1:30 a.m. by a text from his son.
At around 1:40, Christopher, my son, came back from his work. After he finished work, he went for a couple of drinks and then he came back by car, by minicab. And on the way back, he got a phone call from one of his cousins telling him that Grenfell Tower is burning. I'm sorry. Yeah, the Grenfell Tower was ablaze, and he could not. He said, "What are you talking about?" So basically, he reached the foot of Grenfell Tower, and straight away he called me and he told me, "Father, get out of there because the tower is burning." And basically, I was asleep. I was deep asleep, and so I answered the phone and I said, "What are you talking about, Christopher?"
More firemen rushed to the scene and began attacking the fire from the outside. But after initially spreading vertically on the east face to the roof, it then spread horizontally when the cladding lining on the crown architectural detail burned and melted down around the top of the building, allowing fire to then start spreading downward on the other three faces as well.
A few minutes after Christopher sent me a photo, and I've got it on my phone. And he said, you see, I sent you a photo, did you see it? The tower is really burning. So, and the tower, at that stage, 140, 145, was already, the east side of the tower was already, the left east side of the tower was already ablaze all the way up to the last floor.
The apartments filled with dark, toxic smoke as flames crept in through vents and cracks in the window framing. Later, fire roared into the apartments after the heat of the blaze simply burst through windows.
I got ready, I dressed up, I put together my some important documents, my phone, laptop in a rucksack in order to say, now I'm going out. You know, so, and I put a cap and everything. So then I said, okay, let me assess, you know, what the situation is like in the stairway, in the hallway, you know. So I touched my front door, and it was very warm. And as I opened, a lot of I could see nothing. It was totally pitch black. The smoke the big puff of smoke that came in was so strong that made me closed the door straight away. It was very hot, very strong. It was like if you're hit by a gas that you cannot breathe anymore.
Go! Fire!
On the other side of the building, many residents still had no idea of the disaster unfolding. When they found out, many chose to follow the fire brigade's protocol and stayed put, as emergency dispatchers instructed them and as notices posted on each floor advised.
So Christopher kept on calling me, and then he passed me on to the fire marshal, and he, you know, and I said, look, I'm on the 10th floor. I explained to them where I was located, and I said, I'm on the 10th floor. I cannot go outside. It's very dangerous. There is a lot of smoke. It's almost impossible. So I need help to get out of here. I said, okay, mate, stay put. We know you're there. Somebody's coming to get you.
250 firemen were deployed during the emergency. What greeted them was nothing they had ever seen. More was going wrong than they could handle in one night.
At one stage, around 2:30, it was still very dark outside. I realized that there is smoke coming in from the ledges of the windows. Brand new windows just installed a year and a half before. So basically I could see puffs of smoke coming in. And when I saw it, I could not believe it. And I said, my God, what is going on? There should be no smoke coming in. There should be no air. It should be airtight, this place. And it wasn't. So I went to the bathroom. I went to the, I grabbed clothes, towels and bed linen, whatever I had. I went to the bathroom and I put everything in the bathtub, make everything wet. And when because I wanted to put around the window ledges in order to stop the smoke from coming in. But when I came back, the flat was, the living room especially, was totally filled up with grey smoke.
Over the next 6 hours, the inferno killed 72 people, some of London's most vulnerable citizens, victims of dozens of failures in Britain's social housing policies and of a political class that ignored dire warnings of catastrophe on the horizon.
Still trapped inside their flat.
Jumped up while on the flat.
The fire in apartment 16 on the 4th floor on the eastern side of Grenfell Tower spread to the outside, and within 20 minutes, the flames had reached the 23rd floor. And were burning and melting the cladded architectural crown detail installed during renovation to make it look more attractive. Today, the blackened, hollow shell of Grenfell Tower is masked in white plastic sheeting, a grim monument to decades of urban planning failures. The Grenfell Tower stands in the northwest corner of the Kensington and Chelsea borough of London, on the Lancaster West estate. It was owned by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the richest in England, but was managed by the privately owned Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, or KCTMO. In this highly priced West London borough, the average selling price of a home is nearly £1 million. These subsidised dwellings stood on some of the most prized land in the UK. They were home to a happy, multi-ethnic community of families and professionals.
Right next to Grenfell Tower, we would have no major big buildings in there. So basically, the view that you would have from there, it would be totally free and totally, beautiful. My flat was facing east and south, so basically I could see the city from my flat, and on a clear day like today, you could really see very, very far away.
Bramley House is the closest residential building to Grenfell Tower, just across the railway line. It is home to Samia Badani, co-chair of the North Kensington Community Association.
I remember vividly a former resident of Grenfell Tower was at work. My daughter was in a playground because at the bottom of Grenfell Tower there was a playground, and we were all our children went to that Grenfell playground. And my daughter was with her and her daughter, and my daughter fell, and then I got a call from her. I didn't know because my daughter was late, and she told me, don't worry, she's like my daughter, I'm looking after her. It was that sense of human warmth, and these were the residents of Grenfell Tower. Like this, we have a Grenfell community. They were such a big part of the makeup of this neighborhood.
So many people from all over, from North Africa, from sub-Saharan part of the continent, from Portugal, from Spain, from Colombia, South America, lots of Indian people, Bangladeshi, and so on. So basically, it was really a mixed community, and and we, I was quite, very happy living in there. 27 years of my life, so it's a big chunk of my life.
Grenfell Tower was built in 1974 and contained 120 flats, housing between 400 and 600 people like a small vertical village. 3 finger-like buildings extended from the second floor mezzanine, the ground and first floor being a hallway with a shopping level. The walls were built to withstand a fire for about an hour and to contain any fire internally. Geraldine Denning lives in another tower block in South London and is the lead architect of Architects for Social Housing, and has followed the unfolding housing crisis in London for decades.
If a fire takes place in one compartment, the compartmentation means that fire is not allowed to spread to another one. So in a typical tower block like Grenfell Tower, each flat will be a complete compartment, and that would be the walls and the floors and the ceilings. So of course that relies upon the fire protection between compartments. So there's always things which pass through walls and floors. So services, doors and windows, things that break the compartment. So those are obviously the key points where you have to ensure that even if the compartmentation, the strategy is adequate and sufficient and perfectly and a good strategy, all those other little details also have to support that strategy.
The building's original design had fireproofing systems to protect the residents, including a protected central hallway and stairwell equipped with extractor fans and emergency lighting.
The central circulation, the central core of Grenfell, has only one stair. That was traditional and still is current practice in the UK. Because the fire stair isn't deemed in a building which is compartmentalised like that. The stair isn't used for escape, or rather not for emergency evacuation. I think that's a very important thing to consider. So when you have a building which is compartmentalised like this, the general rule is to stay put. So the idea is that if you have a fire in your compartment, The idea is to restrain the fire within that compartment.
Little more than 30 years after the tower was built, the local council began exploring ways of cashing in on the value of this prized stretch of land between Ladbroke Grove and Latimer Road tube stations. Simon Elmer co-directs the association and is the co-author of the first publicly available report on the Grenfell Tower disaster.
Sometime in the early 2000s, the Lancaster West estate, which is what Grenfell Tower sits on, and the neighbouring estate, the Silchester estate, and some of the other area around it, there was a kind of an entire area plan, was put up for regeneration. It's a poor area of Kensington Chelsea, which is one of the richest boroughs, probably the richest borough in the UK. They did this in the middle of the financial crash, and in which, in 2007, after that, house prices in London fell for the first time since, kind of like the late 70s or something. So they came up with a revised plan. This is the council, Kensington Chelsea Council, which was to demolish the Silchester estate still, but to refurbish the Lancaster West estate, including Grenfell Tower.
A few years before Grenfell, an area in this neighbourhood was earmarked, chosen for regeneration. But in local authority language, regeneration means knocking down buildings. It means us losing our homes. Doesn't mean reviving the area.
If they were going to start building new developments, new properties around there, residential properties, for anything between, in that area, certainly over £1 million, maybe £750,000. People are not going to pay for those properties when they're looking across at a post-war 70s concrete council estate.
Michael Jardine is a local activist and architect who lives on the Silchester estate and opposed the controversial Notting Barns master plan.
The Notting Barns master plan was a regeneration of both estates on a loose principle that, they were at the end of their life or were perceived to have antisocial behaviour, or that the council fundamentally didn't like them and didn't see why they had to pay to maintain them, when the brand of Kensington and Chelsea could be projected into this area.
One of the most hotly contested issues was the construction of a privately owned sixth form academy.
In front of the Grenfell Tower, that is as part of the Lancaster West estate, there was a large car park and a series of gardens, which were used by the local residents. The principle of building high tower blocks in the 70s was to actually free up the land around it for recreational use and all sorts of other ideas. What the council came to a decision was to sell that land for the building of a private academy school. The idea behind this, which is used on almost every council estate regeneration scheme, is what's called cross-subsidisation. You privatise part of the land, or you use council land to build market sale developments on it, residences, and then you use the profits from that to subsidise the building of whatever, council housing, affordable housing, or to refurbish council estates that you're not going to demolish.
We used to have 3 football pitches and then a massive car park. And then on the side you would have also a road that would go right next to the tower. Okay, which makes sense. You have access to the tower in case of. They said, okay, we're going to use the space because we need to build an academy in there, we need to build a school, but we're going to refurbish the tower. The tower now is standing right in a cul-de-sac, having access only from a small road, which is called Grenfell Road, with cars parked on each side. And they said, we are trapped in here.
Aesthetically, I think the cladding was originally specified by the architects of the academy to make a whole piece of the academy and the tower.
In 2012, the local council put the tower block refurbishment to tender and eventually opted for a low-cost cladding proposal aimed at improving heat efficiency and beautifying the concrete high-rise.
When you understand the way that a building, a fire system works, it's not just the individual materials, but it's also the way they work together. So what we most likely understand was that there was a piece of some kind of timber, whether it's an oriented OSB board or a ply board that was installed on the surface of the concrete. Onto that you'd have your insulation, and onto that was the aluminium support for the cladding and then the cladding itself. And it was the way in which all those different pieces of the structure worked together, which is what created the inferno.
They filled up the gaps between the concrete and this sheet of aluminium, whatever it was, that was totally flammable. And inside they put some insulation material, yeah? But also in there, they put a lot of rubbish that came from the buildings. Instead of taking it down, they would, stuff it in there. It's like putting dust under the carpet. Nobody will see it.
Given the complaints that were coming from the residents at every stage of the construction and the refurbishment of the building, the complaints of the standard of the installation, there's nothing left of the tower now to know, but in terms of it's highly likely that the standard of installation of some of these things means that a lot of the fire collars, for example, may not have been installed correctly. A lot of the intumescent strips, a lot of the fire protection strategies may well have not been installed adequately correctly. That's highly likely, given what the residents had already said.
Starting in 2012, Grenfell Tower was refurbished with a new external insulation and overcladding system, new windows and window frames with extractor fans. Refurbishment was completed in 2016 at a cost of £8.6 million, £2.5 million less than the original budget. Poor maintenance and non-compliance of some of the refurbishment materials turned a small fire into a catastrophe. The cladding itself, called Celotex, consisted of sheets of polysocyanurate glued to a plywood backing attached to the outer concrete surface of the building. This surface was protected by a Rainobond rain shield made of a sandwich of 6 mm of polyethylene between two 0.5 mm thick aluminium sheets. The original KCTMO project promised zinc outer panels with a higher fire resistance. Expert witnesses testified that cladding panels did not comply with the more rigorous standards for insulating materials on high-rise dwellings. Rather, they only complied with less rigorous specifications for outer surface building materials, even though these panels contained a highly flammable polyethylene core. According to expert reports, the hasty assembly of the cladding also left exposed polyethylene edges and removed fire-stopping mechanisms, especially along the columns running up the building. However, these were not the only factors that killed 72 people that night. Over and beyond the disastrous rain cladding, there were also weatherproofing rubber membranes, spray foam, PVC windows, silicone sealant, glues, and polystyrene window fill panels. All of these highly combustible materials were interconnected by air-filled cavities that allowed the fire to race up, down, and horizontally across the exterior of Grenfell Tower.
The cladding would have added a good 20 or 30 centimetres, 20 or 25 centimetres to the surface of the building. That's to include 150 millimetres of insulation. So you suddenly have the space within this cavity and the insulation itself, which can then pass up through the window frames, essentially, into the interior of the building. And so that becomes a very, very fragile part in the building envelope.
The fact is that the window should have been totally sealed off, airtight. windows and ledges and frames, whatever you want to call them, and they were not. And that's what caused the smoke. That's what was, when you see smoke coming in and it doesn't go out, and what you do, So it's the smoke that kills. It's not the fire itself. And I've got a picture in there of the little puffs of smoke coming in.
There should be fire stopping measures which would go around all the openings and at various stages on each floor, essentially, which would prevent exactly what we saw happening. So it leads us to conclude that those fire stopping measures weren't in place.
By 1:30 a.m, the fire was out of control, but dispatchers continued to tell residents to stay put. 10 residents died trying to go down the stairs. Many were discouraged by the smoke and went upwards, but there was no way onto the roof.
I could see people waving, people calling for help, children screaming. I saw a woman at a window and she just burst into flames. It's just like a gush of fire. We felt their pain. And I think, I don't know how to explain that, but we knew they were going to die. And there's nothing we could do. They were trapped. It was an inferno.
Families with children could be seen waving from their apartments or flashing the lights on and off. At least 4 victims died after having jumped from their burning apartments. The fire brigade was forced by smoke and heat in the only central stairwell to move its command post to the bottom of the building. Rescue teams were sent to save people trapped in their apartments. The lifts did not comply with fire safety rules and were unavailable for firefighters to use. Some of the apartments had also been renumbered, and some had no numbers on their doors at all. In other cases, the stranded victims had moved to their neighbours or further up the building to the very top, where firefighters had trouble reaching them. At 2:35 a.m, the fire brigade told dispatchers that stay put was no longer an option, and residents should try to get out if possible. It was too late. 114 were still inside. Only 42 made it out alive.
The second time that I tried to get out, to try to see if I could go down, if the smoke in the hallway would be a bit better, a bit clearer, it was even worse. And what put me off as well was the second time when I tried to get out was that noises was coming. I could hear some noises and people screaming. So it was really discouraging, to try to go out and to do something stupid.
By 3 a.m, the fire in the Grenfell Tower had spread up the vertical columns, then horizontally around the crown, and then back down in other directions, and then, like a macabre Christmas tree, spread sideways into the apartments, one by one. These incredible infrared images from the Metropolitan Police helicopter show how the flames spread around the building. The flames spread relentlessly through air cavities, fueled by the polyethylene sandwich, melting the plastics, polycyanurate panels, and aluminium debris, eventually setting the panels on fire. An unbearable stench filled the area.
And there were gas explosions, and it felt like the tower was moving sideways, and we were quite terrified that it would collapse. We were pretty much on our own. I think we felt really unsafe. There were burning debris coming to our courtyards. It was terrible. I could, at some point, I needed to go through the police cordon, and the police officer told me, "You can go, but it's at your own peril." And I went, and I saw my neighbours in shock, sheer shock.
Daniela Fetkensu is a preacher of the nearby Notting Hill Methodist Church, where much of the community assembled during the fire.
You could hear the most horrific screams, and it got to a stage anyway where we were told we had to leave because of the debris that was coming from the buildings. don't know what they were, but they could harm us, and the fumes and that sort of thing. And the community, the people, the shock on their faces.
The rescue efforts were tireless, but slow and ineffective. Bodycam footage worn by a fire chief recorded him begging for an accurate set of floor plans from the KCTMO.
As far as I'm aware, the guy from the TMO, the MD from the TMO, has got plans on his phone, and he was looking to ping them through to somebody. So,
for what it's worth, I've got a picture from the BA control of the layout of a standard floor, but also we know which numbers the flats are.
Sending it on a phone is no good for me. No. So, and I hate to say this, and please don't record this in the minutes, but having experienced the back end of the Lacanau inquiry, having been in charge of other major incidents, I'm telling you now that the fact you have not been able to get me a set of plans, actually as a set of plans, is a major deficiency.
5:30, just before my last conversation with Christopher, I saw the fire crawling down on the cladding on the outside of my son's window. So I saw, and when I saw the fire, I said, bloody hell! Now the fire is, that's when I got a bit more nervous. But the fact is that then the firefighters from the high ladder, they sprayed a lot of water, and then they put off the fire, and they sprayed a lot of water into my and Christopher's bedroom as well. Through only the windows were closed, but there was a little vent at the top that was open, and through that vent, a lot of water came through. But I was happy to see the water.
More had gone wrong than anyone would have imagined.
If that fire hadn't started, none of this would have happened. The next thing went wrong was that as soon as the fire was able to get outside of the building, there's a debate as to whether or not the construction of the windows, so the refurbishment of the windows, the new position of the windows was outside of the original frame of the building. The reality was it was a very hot night, and the chances were everybody's windows would have been open at that point. The new material, which was placed onto the building, did transmit the flame across its surface. One of the key mechanisms for that spread of flame was what could be understood as a series of chimneys. There were gaps which moved up through the building to enable the draft of air to pull the flames vertically up the building.
The cladding system on Grenfell was such that once it had caught fire, that building was going to go up, I think, like a tinderbox. But that didn't mean that the people in it had to die. The residents had been complaining about the poor quality of the renovation of the interior, which involved lots of fire safety measures, the securing of the compartmentalisation of it, the fact that the smoke extractors didn't work, the fact that the emergency lighting in the stairwell didn't work, the fact that, as they reported, gas mains unboxed ran down the fire stairway, which is kind of the extent of the lunacy of the refurbishment of that.
Antonio Roncolato was still alive.
Around 5:30, 6 o'clock, I had the last conversation with Christopher, and I said, Christopher, listen, I've been here for so long. They told me that they would come and get me. They told me to stay put, even though I cannot go out. And I said, I need you to, I need to speak to someone to see really what's happening. And he ran right next to the tower, and then he passed, one fire marshal or fire brigade man or something. And so I said, look, this is happening. I'm still here. You told me to stay put. And I tried twice to go out, and the smoke is horrible. So then this guy told me, it was around 6 o'clock, he told me, okay, mate, wait a second, literally like that, wait a second. So then I could hear that he was talking to someone else. He talked to 2 firemen, and then he said, okay, be prepared because somebody's coming to you now.
Others were talking to people trapped on the inside. Several broadcast on Facebook Live and used other social media to communicate their last desperate feelings to the world. The thoughts of those who survived went to those still trapped. At last, Antonio Roncolato was able to escape.
I got ready, and then a few minutes after, 6 o'clock, 2 firefighters came in to my flat. They knocked, they banged at the door. I opened it straight away, and they told me, how many of you? I said, there's only me. Right, we're going to do the following. I'm going to be in the front. You are going to be in the middle, behind me. You grab me from my jacket at the back, and my colleague is going to be in the back of you, and he will guide you through as well. So, and they said, are you ready? I said, yes. He took my hat off, and he put a wet towel that he found on the floor. He put it over me. I had a wet towel, small wet towel on my mouth, so to protect my breathing basically. And on the way down, I stepped over a dead body, and I couldn't move any further down. So the guy behind me, he lifted my right foot, and he freed me, and then we moved on.
By failing to properly assess fire danger in the refurbished, cladded Grenfell Tower, London had failed its most vulnerable citizens, many of whom were foreigners or of non-British descent. Entire families died in the Grenfell Tower fire, huddled together in their flats or fleeing down the stairwell. The nation mourned 72 dead from all over the world. Antonio Roncolato survived.
I was the one, like, don't worry, I'm here, I'm fine, everything's okay, I got out, But it was extremely, extremely stressful. And mainly for Christopher, because Christopher was outside the tower, watching the beast burning and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Me inside, and even though I was trying to, because I had to reassure him that I was okay, that this is not my day, that I will make it, that everything's gonna be fine, that we're gonna be together again. But he was not sure.
In 2009, rain cladding on another council building, Lakanal House in southern London, caught fire. 6 people died.
After the Lakanal House fire in 2009, the coroner took about 3 years to write this report, and it made a series of recommendations. One of the key ones was that not the cause of the fire, but the virulence of the fire, how a small fire managed to kill 6 people and spread up so quickly, was that it used aluminium composite rain cladding. And this is the form that's used on the, similar form to used on the Grenfell Tower fire.
If sprinklers had been installed, the fire would not have spread to the outer flammable surface of the building. But sprinkler systems are not required by law to be retrofitted onto older buildings in Britain.
The all-party parliamentary fire safety and rescue group, which is composed of, I guess, the most senior fire experts in the country, sent letters urging 4 subsequent ministers, 2 ministers and 2 under-ministers, in the Department of Communities in Local Government to pass legislation for the retrofitting of sprinklers to residential dwellings. And this urging was sat on by subsequent ministers over a very long time.
The type of cladding used in the Grenfell Tower is banned in Germany and in the USA on high-rise buildings above 18 meters. Building regulations in Britain require external surfaces do not spread fire, but do not take into account the possibility of fire spreading via exposed flammable edges. After a similar fire in Australia, a senior fire safety engineer testified that 1 kilo of polyethylene is equivalent to 5.5 litres of petrol.
What was produced was a kind of cocktail. Within that panel, it's possible to add certain additives which might have sort of mineralized that, which I think potentially would have reduced the fire, the flammability of that material. As far as I'm aware, they didn't use those panels. But yeah, I mean, the speed at which it went up the building, I'd say yes, pretty much was petrol. If you'd seen the flames and the footage filmed from all those people's mobile phone cameras, then yeah, that was like igniting petrol on a building, yeah.
London is one of the richest cities in the world, and land is extremely valuable. The local boroughs stand to make a fortune from selling the land to developers who promise that a certain number of social homes will be retained. This rarely happens.
About 20 years ago, probably a little bit longer, there was what we're in the middle of now, or 20 odd years into, which is a national program called the Estate Regeneration Program. In London, it almost always means, regeneration always means demolition and redevelopment. That's because the Estate Regeneration Program in its current form is not about refurbishing homes, but of getting access to the land that these council estates are built on.
Many Grenfell residents are still without permanent housing. They are eager to see justice done and the truth about what went wrong that night come out in the ongoing inquiry. They have publicly defended members of the fire brigades, who some see as scapegoats for a much bigger problem. Local MP Emma Dent-Coad joined a march in support of the men and women who risked their lives battling the Grenfell Tower fire.
There's been no change at the council. This could happen again tomorrow. If this had happened to their neighbours, they would have dealt with it. And I genuinely think there's a really horrible and unforgivable undercurrent of racism there. They may not even be aware of it themselves, but they do think that people in the tower are lesser beings, and I've seen that many, many times. I'm on the Fire Safety and Rescue Committee in Parliament, and we're constantly making recommendations. We have the Fire Minister in, ask him questions. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he's very offhand about it. It's really, this could happen again tomorrow.
As the flames were eating through the Grenfell Tower, this multi-ethnic community came together. In what was a makeshift emergency shelter under the overpass, survivors have since posted their personal stories, memories, and calls for justice. Children put up drawings of the night. People of different faiths came together to help their fellow neighbours.
I remember there are lots of people crying, saying, I can't find my cousin, I can't find my daughter, I can't find this. And it got to a situation where we say, what do they look like? Photographs and that sort of thing. We had the Notting Hill van outside, and they started putting pictures of, the missing people on there. And that sort of like grew, really, and then it was on the railings, and then it was on the walls, and then it was just all around the community. Because people were just saying, have you seen this person? Because people were obviously running to all sorts of areas and and some people were not actually in at the time, so there were lots of people who were looking for their family members.
The anger that still simmers under the ashes of the gutted Grenfell Tower is fueling a new civic movement of solidarity and self-governance that may one day be the cornerstone of a new community.
I think what the tragedy did, it highlighted that stigma. I would call it stigma because it's not just race or faith, it's social status somehow. It's like living in social housing is a bad thing, that we can't be educated people, or we don't have a career. And when you look at the makeup of the local area, people are working, people are, have degrees, and it's like no matter what we do in our life, no matter how high we reach in our life, we're still labeled as low-class people.
More than 2 years after 72 people died in the Grenfell Tower fire, the inquiry has yet to determine officially what went wrong. But resilient residents have Grenfell in their hearts and are not about to let the country forget.
Any local authority would have lost its right to make decisions for people it serves. But this local authority continued to do so while it was still under a question mark as to its fitness to exercise their duty of care. They are under criminal investigation for potential breaches of health and safety regulations. why should we trust them? Why should we go to them? So it created a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by the community. Hence, we set up the space here, because either you bring government to take over, or you bring commissioners to take over, or the community to take over.
The Lancaster estate residents plan to keep pushing for justice, calling for public and private sector accountability and lobbying for policy changes that will help prevent any such tragedy from happening again. Only if the lessons of the Grenfell Tower fire are learned and real changes arise from the inquiry will the deaths of their friends, family and neighbours not have been in vain. On June the 3rd, 1998, a high-speed Deutsche Bahn train travelling at nearly 200 kilometers per hour derailed and crashed into a road bridge near the village of Eschede in northern Germany, killing 101 and injuring 100. It was the worst rail disaster in the history of Germany and the most catastrophic high-speed train crash ever recorded. What went wrong with Intercity Express, or ICE 884, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, as it hurtled along its route between Munich and Hamburg? Incredibly, the disaster was set in motion by a single, tiny fatigue crack. The crack unravelled the outer rim of a bogie, pushing the carriage off the tracks and against the pylons of a road bridge, causing it to collapse. The remaining train cars crashed into the wreckage, folding up on each other accordion style. In 3.5 seconds, the high-speed train came to a catastrophic halt. Only a lucky few survived.
I had the same grave kind of injuries as the dead. I was really lucky that I was not among the dead, as I had the same serious injuries as the dead. There were so many dead. And when you have to come to terms with that, there were children, adults, the elderly. It was disturbing beyond anything I had ever known before.
The inquiry lasted 53 days and led to manslaughter charges for at least 2 Deutsche Bahn employees. The accident eventually changed train safety and improved emergency response procedures in Germany, but left a nation shocked. Munich, Bavaria. It is early on the morning of June the 3rd, 1998, and commuters and families are boarding trains in the Munich Hauptbahnhof, headed north for business and pleasure. The ICE 884 Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen is headed to Hamburg, with scheduled stops in the picturesque cities of Augsburg, Nuremberg, Würzburg, Fulda, Kassel, Göttingen and Hanover. When the doors finally close and the train pulls out of the station, 287 passengers are on board, settling into their travel routines. Udo Bauch was on a business trip to Hamburg and boarded the ICE in Fulda. He knew the voyage would be fast and smooth, and he'd be able to get a little work done en route. He was sitting alone in first class, coach 11.
The weather was very nice that day. It was a summer day, and my trip started well. My wife brought me to the station, and I got on the train. I wanted to go to Hamburg that day. I knew, in any case, that day I wanted to work and was alone in the coach. I had my laptop with me because I wanted to work in peace and quiet, so I had no other passengers with me, and I had planned it that way, so I could work in peace.
About 130 kilometers south of Hamburg, with only 40 minutes left to the final destination, it quickly became clear there was something serious amiss in Coach 1. Unusual vibrations had been noticed by previous passengers, and now something even worse happened. A steel shaft shot through the armrest of Jörg Dittmann, a passenger in Coach 1. Rather than pull the emergency brake, he went to find a ticket collector, who told him it was company policy to investigate before stopping the train. All of a sudden, the rear coaches began travelling on a different set of rails, hurtling horizontally towards the bridge, slamming into it. The bridge collapsed onto the train, crushing the rear half of Coach 5. The restaurant coach, 6, was completely crushed to just 15 centimeters in height. There was no chance of survival for anyone dining in Coach 6 at the time of the accident. The remaining cars jackknifed into one another.
I looked up at the clock, and I was working on my laptop, and then, all of a sudden, there was a blow, an impact like nothing I had ever heard. And from then on, it all went very fast. Then, within the coach, I was thrown about, over and under, and from left to right. All sorts of chairs and train parts were flying against me, until I was just suddenly lying there, and I knew something terrible had happened. I thought 2 trains had collided.
I heard over the radio what was happening while on my way to Eschede. And then, as we neared Eschede, we were able to speak to the mayor, who was able to tell us that it's an ICE train, it's completely destroyed, and the bridge is also completely destroyed, and it all looks quite horrific. That was the first information I had.
Also schon auf dem Weg dahin war durch den Funkverkehr, den man ja
We could hear the radio traffic as we were on our way to Eschede, but it was confused information, as the various frequencies and traffic were all over the place, and it was difficult to make out.
Genau auszumachen, aber es war alles völlig busy. Und als wir dann nach Eschede kamen und auch auf diesen Brückenkopf...
Then, as I came to Eschede and drove up to the top of where the bridge was, there lay the ICE train, totally destroyed. I had never seen anything like it. I was perplexed, as I was not at all trained for what lay before me.
War ich in dem Sinne auch gar nicht vorbereitet.
2 Deutsche Bahn railway technicians who had been doing maintenance near the bridge would be killed instantly when car number 4 came hurtling toward them at 200 kilometers per hour.
Der dritte Wagen.
The back of the third wagon went onto a different rail, and then it derailed, and the back of the wagon hit the bridge pylon, and it began to collapse. The fourth wagon was able to come under the bridge, and then the bridge collapsed onto wagon 5, destroying it completely. Then the other wagons just piled up against the bridge.
Dann die anderen Wagen haben sich dann vor der Brücke zusammengeschoben.
The front power car, which had detached from the rest of the train, coasted for another 3 kilometers until coming to a stop just past Eschede railway station. Residents in the tiny town just 130 kilometers south of Hamburg had no idea what was happening just south of their normally quiet and tidy German village. Andreas Effinghausen was one of the first police officers to arrive at the bridge from Celle.
Und als wir dann dort ankamen,
as I came into town, I stopped the car and got out to go on foot, and that's when I saw that the bridge was completely down. So I went down along the embankment by the bridge, and I saw the train, and a whole wagon had been split open. And as I looked around, I thought, what am I going to do here? I just had no idea what to do next.
Und Dann habe ich da erstmal gestanden und war völlig fassungslos. Ich wusste gar nicht, was ich machen sollte.
Once I came to this sudden halt and was lying there. I was totally pinned and my leg was pinned and I couldn't move. I could only cry out and hope that someone found me.
Es war allerdings nicht zu hören, es war absolute Ruhe.
You couldn't hear anything. There was complete silence, not a sound. So I went down around the train and I simply called out, "Hello?" And Udo Bauch answered me.
Udo Bauch mir geantwortete.
Hello, hello, is anyone there? He yelled. And I heard it, and I tried to pull myself up and say, yes, my name is Ugo Bauch, please help me.
The local fire chief, Gerd Backerberg, immediately began to organize the emergency response.
Ja,
The disaster site was about 500, 600 meters total, since the first 5 wagons had come under the bridge, and the others were all piled on top of each other along the track. One wagon was lying beneath the destroyed bridge, and all the others were folded up like an accordion in front of the bridge.
eine Ziehharmonika vor der Brücke aufgetürmt dann.
An hour and a half later, the district government had declared a civil state of emergency. Immediately after the train derailment on June 3rd, 1998, more than 100 rescue workers from around the region were dispatched to the scene, and within hours, more than 1,800 personnel had arrived. Edvard Hüls was the emergency room physician on duty in the nearby city of Celle and immediately rushed to the disaster site to help.
The first thing I thought as I was standing there was, what am I even going to do here? It is a question one asks oneself. You suddenly understand what it means when you have an education as a nursing assistant, and then suddenly your skills are going to be needed in a way that you could never have ever predicted or imagined.
A nearby hall was turned into an emergency triage center and makeshift morgue, as rescuers feverishly tried to extract the living from the wreckage.
The train was impenetrable due to the windows and the doors. This was a basic problem we had from the very beginning. And as a result, we could only treat the patients who we could get to in the very last wagons, put onto stretchers, and then beginning doing triage that was needed.
Wir haben es zum Schluss aufgegeben. Es war nicht möglich.
We eventually gave up trying to make holes big enough in the doors and windows to get the patients out to be treated. At that point, the fire department helped us. And since the last 6 wagons were all lying next to each other, we were able to access the coaches through the aisles, cutting out the seats as we went through and slowly working from the back toward the front. But it was very difficult.
Hat sich dann von hinten langsam weiter nach vorne gearbeitet, aber es war sehr, sehr aufwendig.
Utter devastation was everywhere. For 20 minutes, rescuers stepped gingerly around live railway electrical cables carrying 15,000 volts. The train cars were horribly mangled, and rescuers struggled to reach the dozens of wounded and dying inside due to the impenetrable windows and doors.
Ja, die Verletzten aus den Waggons.
It was very difficult to get the wounded out of the train, but we were able to get to those we could reach quickly, and by 1400 hours, we had finished that part of the rescue. Between 14 and 1430, we had all the wounded people rescued and transported to nearby clinics or hospitals. It actually had gone fairly quickly.
Ging dann doch verhältnismäßig schnell.
What had gone wrong with this train, the pride of Germany's railways? The first clue was that part of the railway line had penetrated the floor of carriage 1. Something had literally lifted the train off the track, and it could only have been a defective wheel. The first high-speed train debuted in Japan in 1965, but Germany was not far behind, adopting high-speed train travel with its intercity rail system in 1971. Germany's upgraded high-speed ICE train service was launched to great fanfare in June 1991. They had speed up to 280 kilometers per hour, safety, comfort, and state-of-the-art engineering. Not surprisingly, the fast and comfortable trains with amenities like dining cars, telephone service, and entertainment made the trains popular from the outset.
This train was the flagship of the German fleet. It was important that it was seen to be operating properly and providing comfortable service for passengers. And it soon became apparent, though, there was a lot of transmission of noise and vibration into the carriages, particularly the restaurant cars and the other carriages. It was decided to try and solve this problem by introducing these rather peculiar wheels which had a separate rim separated from the hub by rubber pads.
Germany's ICE trains were originally equipped with single-cast wheel sets, known as monoblock wheels, a design that engineers realized suffered from metal fatigue that caused vibration at cruising speed. They were, in essence, a legacy design. However, Deutsche Bahn exchanged them for new wheels based on streetcar wheels used on trams.
These wheels had been used very successfully in a lot of low-speed applications in tram systems. I think Hanover was one of the cities. There were others too that used them. And so they had some sort of pedigree, but they'd never been used for high-speed operations. They were successful in cutting down noise transmission, and so they proved to be in the ICE trains for a considerable time. So things looked as if the problem had been solved.
The new and improved ICE wheel tyre design consisted of a wheel body surrounded by a 20mm thick rubber damper and then a relatively thin metal rim. This successfully reduced the vibration at cruising speeds, but few tests were done on how the new rim design would hold up to the wear and tear of high-speed operation.
That is, a wear process takes place, and the shape of the wheel conforms more and more to the rounded shape of the rail head, which leads to unsatisfactory running of the train. So periodically the wheels are reprofiled after quite long periods of time. In these rimmed wheels, where the rim was separate from the hub of the wheel, this continual reprofiling reduced the thickness of the rim. And so the bending that took place every time the wheel rotated between the separate rim and the solid hub, separated by these rubber pads, grew greater because the rim became more flexible.
The Fraunhofer Institute for Structural Durability and System Reliability in Darmstadt presented 300 pages of expert testimony at the trial. They found that a cracking inside the rim of the wheel caused by excessive load and wear was responsible for the accident. Professor Roderick Smith is one of the engineers called in to find out what went wrong.
When the wheels were examined for cracks, in a normal solid wheel, one examines the outer tread of the wheel, where the cracks are likely to form between the wheel and the rail. On this occasion, nobody was examining the inside of the wheel, and so the crack remained undetected in inspections because it wasn't being looked for.
Engineers found that the rims became flattened into an elliptical shape as the wheel turned. Cracks could also form on the inside of this type of tyre, which was never tested in the entire 4 years it was in operation. But could regular maintenance have detected the worn-out rims? Many warning signs went unheeded. The world had never seen a high-speed rail crash of such epic, tragic proportions. The mangled cars of the ICE 884 train Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, en route from Munich to Hamburg, had not only derailed, but also hit an overpass, causing it to collapse onto the second half of the train, which then piled up in a zigzag motion. The biggest challenge at first was knowing the scale of the disaster. Just how many people had boarded the train?
Dieser ICE hatte ja eine Sitzplatzkapazität von 709.
The ICE had a seating capacity of 795 seats. The emergency manager of the Deutsche Bahn came to the town and told us, "It's not like an airplane when you have assigned seats and check in and you can tell who is present or not, but rather people buy a ticket from point A to B, and whether or not they are on the train or decide to take another one, you do not know. But," he said, "based on this time of year, this time of the week, it was a Wednesday, and based on the time of day, that on the train they estimated there were approximately 200 to 300 people. And indeed, that proved to be correct."
Und das hat sich dann nachher auch bestätigt.
By 2 p.m., they had a full picture of what they faced. 124 injured, more than 80 of them seriously. 16 had walked away, and 101 dead and dying in the impenetrable or crushed train cars.
Also unverletzte oder leicht verletzte Personen.
Lightly wounded or those without injuries were in the first 3 wagons. In the 4th wagon were more gravely wounded, but after the 5th wagon, it was mostly just dead.
Wagen 5 waren dann Tote zu beklagen.
Lying in pain, pinned beneath parts of his coach, Udo Bauch saw his life flash before his eyes.
And then you see these near-death images that flash through your head. From your childhood, your youth, when you become a parent, the night you met your wife, the whole life ran through my head, and I knew either I am going to die or somehow I will come out of this. And then, at a certain point, I heard the voice of my rescuer, Andrea, a policeman from Celle, who I am still friends with today. And I was a bit more reassured that someone had found me.
Hat mich dann gebeten, seine Frau zu verständigen.
He begged me to contact his wife. He gave me names and a phone number and asked me to call. I asked him about his injuries and he said that he thought that his entire left side must be broken. He was in a lot of pain, so I told him I would go and get a doctor. And we would try to get him out as fast as possible.
My wife had to search for me. She had brought me to the train platform and then gone home and heard about the derailment. Then she noted the train's name, Wilhelm König Röntgen. She heard it on the television and she thought, that is the train. My husband is inside. Then she made contact with the authorities, who gave her a long list of hospitals where the various patients were. And she had to call and call. But the answer everywhere was negative. And then the next to the last one was the hospital in Hanover. And there they had an unknown patient wearing blue pants, a wedding ring with the name Monica engraved into it, and was approximately 30 years old. And it was with this glimmer of hope that she went to Hanover to search for me.
Udo's rescuer, Andreas Effinghausen, also went to see him at the hospital. He was met by Monica, relieved to have finally found her husband and be at his side.
Also sie hat mich erstmal ganz herzlich begrüßt.
First, she warmly said hello to me, and then we went up to intensive care to see Udo. He wasn't totally conscious, he was still in a medically induced coma. But later he told me he could hear my voice.
Gehört, dass ich da war, also er hat die Stimme gehört, aber er konnte eben halt noch nicht antworten.
ER physician Dr. Edvard Hüls was confronted with the most difficult choice a doctor can face.
To be in a situation where so many patients need your help, They were all trying to talk to me and say, "We need a doctor." And I had my kit with me so they could recognize me as a real doctor from afar. And they all thought, "Oh, he will come right away." Yet he is not coming over to me. It is not something you can train for. Getting through those very difficult moments and decisions was very hard. I couldn't care for some of the patients, even when I knew things were going quite badly for them.
Ich sag mal, das war eigentlich das Schlimmste.
It was one of the worst experiences I've ever had. I've seen many road accidents and I've seen many injured people as a policeman, but so many people, such a massive accident scene. This was almost impossible for me. It took a long time for me to get my head around all that had happened. For that reason, still today, I remember every detail. I'll never forget it.
Ich weiß heute noch genau jedes Detail, also ich werde das auch nicht vergessen.
The accident took 6 days to clear so that trains could resume running on the busy Munich to Hamburg line.
Wir haben tatsächlich bei einer Lagefeststellung nachmittags 15 Uhr
At a certain rescue site, we, at a certain point at 1500 hours, reported that we had 1,250 vehicles working directly on site.
Dort waren rund 350.
There had been a total of 1,800 vehicles, including 350 trucks that were attached to various entities, as well as 39 aircraft, which was the biggest air response in the history of the German Republic since the war.
Insgesamt in diesem Einsatz 39 Luftfahrzeuge eingebunden gewesen.
Forensic teams began the grim task of collecting body parts in small grey trays. Entire families were wiped out in 3.5 seconds. The train had started in southern Germany, and there were many, many families, especially children with their mothers on their way to the North Sea, and in the end we had more than 30 dead children. But it could have been even worse. Another high-speed train had just passed under the very same bridge. Udo Bauch was disabled.
I had third-degree head injuries, jaw fractured in 4 places, skull fractures, and my left leg was broken. I had multiple fractures. Everything was broken. I had the same grave injuries as the dead. And I was really lucky not to be among the dead, because I had many of the same injuries as the dead.
The extent of grief in the tiny village was overwhelming. A special trauma team moved into the back of the small hall that had been turned into triage center and morgue. The psychological support team would remain in place for over a year at a center erected in the nearby city of Celle, and eventually become a model for trauma counseling and disaster response in Germany. Through the police and the border patrol, we brought in psychological teams and cared for the wounded, the relatives who were arriving, and also later on, also the rescuers who were on site. Later, a counseling center was erected in the nearby town of Celle with a pastor, a psychologist, and a typist who worked alongside them. And this center was in service for over a year and a half. The accident happened in a matter of seconds, but the catastrophe was actually set in motion by one wholly preventable failure: a tiny fatigue crack in the steel tire on a wheel of the third axle of the first car.
Suddenly the rim fractured and sort of spread itself out like a spear and came up through the seat of one of the passengers was sitting there, and it came up through his seat and caused considerable concern, of course. The passenger rushed to the guard, who was several carriages away from him, to tell him what had happened and to stop the train. Apparently the guard was rather slow in reacting, but started walking with the passenger back to the site of the damage. But before they could get there, the trailing end of the rim caught on a set of points below the train and derailed one of the bogies of the carriage that the train was on.
So what went wrong? 3 separate automated checks indicated a defect in the ICE train's wheels. The train's onboard computer also showed that conductors and other train staff had filed 8 separate complaints about noises and other vibrations being generated by the defective wheel, yet the company did not replace it. The train conductor also failed to stop the train in time.
Of course, it's relatively easy to run computer models, quite complicated computer models, but the question is, are we modelling the right thing? And that can only be answered by testing. And here the structure was so different from the conventional wheel that testing would have revealed the difference in the structure and the different location of where the cracks were going to form. The fact that if a crack was going to initiate, it would be initiated on the inside of the rim, which normally is not a place you would look at because it would be part of a solid wheel. And the fact that the reprofiling process had not been rethought to accommodate the separate rim. I think these are actually very fundamental issues.
But while the disintegrated wheel might have been the root cause of the accident, the damage became catastrophic due to the proximity of the bridge and the position of the wheel on a car at the front end of the train, which led to such a large number of cars derailing.
If the train had been stopped immediately the accident would have happened, the disaster might have been avoided. And one of the ways in which that could have happened was if the driver had some indication that there was a major fault on one of the bogies. He actually had an indication of the level of the toilet water in each of the carriages, but not on the condition of the bogies.
The relathing of the wheels had created a microscopic crack on the inner surface of the outer rim that failed.
They examined carefully all the wheels on the similar trains. They found, interestingly, that only the wheels that had been reprofiled, I think 6 times, had cracks inside. And of the population that had been reprofiled 6 times, I think 80% of them had little cracks there that could have grown quickly. Of the wheels that hadn't been reprofiled 6 times, but less times, they didn't find any cracks. So clearly, the limit of the reprofiling had been exceeded, and it caused them to rethink the whole business, and they went back to running on solid wheels.
The snapped rim shot into the seat in carriage 1, but also hooked a set of points on the railway line that pushed the following carriage onto a parallel set of rails. The carriages crashed into the bridge, which fell onto them, and the end of the train piled up against the crashed carriage at 200 kilometers per hour. If the dragging rail rim hadn't switched the points, the crash simply would not have happened.
So what we had was the initial breakage of the wheel unleashed a series of incidents, each of which compounded the consequences, and the final consequence, of course, was the disaster when the train hit the bridge.
Embittered survivors and relatives of those killed accused Deutsche Bahn of ignoring wheel fatigue during previous wheel checks.
Well, a legal process was applied. I don't think it was as searching as it might have been, and if it had have been, I think it may have come to a conclusion that really shifted more of the responsibility for this onto bad design at Deutsche Bahn.
In 2003, a German court abandoned negligence cases against 3 Deutsche Bahn engineers, fining each of them €10,000 and concluding they bore no serious blame for the disaster.
The trial was very painful because the outcome was such that no one was found guilty. The fact that the engineers were given just a mild fine. The outcome of the trial was for the survivors and the families of the victims. Well, it was like a slap in the face.
More than 20 years after Germany's worst rail accident, many things have changed. The Eschede disaster was one of the tragic events that led to the creation of a new federal agency in 2002 and the establishment of a psychosocial emergency care network across Germany. Edvard Hüls is still one of the lead emergency doctors in the timbered German city of Celle. The approach, he recalls, was innovative at the time.
Wir haben dieses Psychologie-Team nicht mitgebracht. Das gab es zu der damaligen Zeit überhaupt gar nicht.
We developed the psychological trauma team concept ourselves, because back then such a thing did not exist. Eschede was the first disaster where a team of counselors were brought on site to address the needs of not just the grieving and wounded, but also the rescuers who were working there. When rescuers would come out of the wreckage, they could stop in for a briefing, talk to someone. At the time, this was something very new.
Dann haben wir ein Briefing hinterher, wir sprechen mit euch. Das war etwas ganz, ganz Neues.
Within weeks, points on the entire German railway network were checked to see if they were near possible obstacles.
They then instigated a big investigation. They contacted a lot of experts of fatigue, because this failure was clearly a fatigue crack that had grown in the rim, of which I was one. We spent two and a half years arguing with each other, discussing with DB engineers, trying to find out the history of the decision to introduce these wheels, what the testing had been, what the thoughts had been about the inspection of them, and so on.
Wheels on other trains were replaced with the safer monoblock type.
My argument would be is the protocols weren't applicable to this particular incident, stripped away from the overall view. The detail of the design of the wheel was so different, they shouldn't have applied existing design standards to it. And they shouldn't have hidden behind the fact that it complied with those existing design standards, because it was a completely different structure and it changed the system behaviour.
Trains were also refitted with windows that have predetermined braking seams, as rescue workers at the scene of the disaster had difficulty reaching victims due to the resistance of the train's pressure-proof windows. After 27 days in a medically induced coma and 6 major operations, Udo Bauch lives with a 100% handicap.
Ich habe nach wie vor, auch jetzt noch nach 20 Jahren, sehr starke Schmerzen immer wieder.
I still have very strong pain, even today, after 20 years. When I walk, it all hurts. I have a 100% handicap. There is also anxiety. My life is very, very different, and every day I have to fight through this pain and these obstacles and handicaps.
Udo Bauch decided to build his own memorial and began planning a chapel in his hometown of Eichenzell.
Many people come here. In the first year after the accident, we had 5,000 visitors. We get prayer groups, victim support groups. And it is nice to see that our town is sought out by those who want the victims of the Eschede disaster to be remembered.
Udo Bauch only received an apology some 20 years after the accident, after having to fight Deutsche Bahn every step of the way.
Deutsche Bahn was very insensitive in the time right after the disaster. They sent us letters with ICE train stamps. You had to fight for every single euro of compensation. At the time, everyone said, "We will absolutely compensate you big time." But as a victim, we did not notice that. We had to fight for every little thing. Every little bill that needed to be paid was a battle. It was a very heavy burden.
Nearly 3 years after the disaster, an official memorial was established, paid for in part by Deutsche Bahn. "400 relatives and many dignitaries, as well as rescue personnel and local Eschede residents, attended the opening ceremony. Still today, many continue to gather here on the solemn anniversary of the accident every June. "101 wild Japanese cherry trees were planted here, one for each fatality. They do not bear fruit, but blossom every spring in memory of the victims. A place of solace and reflection for families, rescuers, and the villagers of Eschede whose lives go on, despite being forever marked by the tragedy. In one's life, one can never forget the images that one at the time had to live through on the 3rd of June 1998. And every year, when the anniversary of the disaster comes around, those pictures inevitably come back, and our thoughts go back to all those who lost their lives in the derailment.
The memories retreated a little bit into the background, but they're still there, because every now and then I drive over and stop for a moment, looking, standing there for a brief time, and then I see everything before my eyes, just as it was.
Passengers in the trains that speed by here every day at 200 kilometers per hour on their way to and from Hamburg are traveling too fast to see the names of all those who lost their lives here on June the 3rd, 1998. But if they happen to look out the window toward the thick forests and fields of heather as they pass by Eschede, their gaze is met by a cherry orchard planted to remember the 101 dead, and by a steep flight of stone steps leading up to a gate, framing the blue heavens beyond. On a cold January day in 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger blew apart high above Kennedy Space Center on Cape Canaveral, just 73 seconds after launch. A rubber seal called an O-ring had failed, and a plume of fire leaked out of the solid fuel booster, igniting the gigantic fuel tank. With millions of people tuned in live on TV, Americans watched in disbelief as a sinister white plume streaked across the sky, and 7 astronauts, including New Hampshire high school teacher Krista McAuliffe, plummeted helplessly 20,000 meters to their deaths. America was plunged into uncertainty and grief, and questioned NASA's ability to manage the immensely complex space program effectively.
He said, I would not recommend that we launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was primarily based on the experience we'd had 1 year earlier that concerned us. And frankly, I was shocked because I felt that that was a slam dunk. They would accept that and just postpone the launch. They immediately started questioning the basis for making such a recommendation based on the material presented.
The single message that came out in a direct quote to me from one of the most senior administrators in NASA when I said, we're going to lose one of these shuttles, and I said that 3 months before Challenger, said to me, our job is to launch on time, every time. And it was one of those hairs on the back of the neck moment when I realized they're not listening.
When a chastened NASA emerged from the tragedy, shuttle flights resumed. The shuttle pushed the frontiers of technology to the utter limits, and this incredibly complex machine continued flying for another quarter of a century, with astronauts from around the world aboard.
I almost thought, I'm the weak link. I was the one who had to perform at the level needed to be up to the standard of the others. My work was as important as the others. I had to trust the others, the astronauts who were with me, but also those setting up the launch, those who followed the operations. And at the same time, they had to trust me. Jokingly, I thought, I don't care if the shuttle blows up, as long as it's not my fault.
Basta che non sono stato io.
A small group of brave engineers, analysts, and astronauts risked their careers so that the managerial errors behind the Challenger disaster never happened again. It took 2 years before the problem was fixed and the next shuttle launched. One of the last Space Shuttle missions is about to launch. This complex machine has completed 135 missions. Italy's first astronaut, Paolo Nespoli, flew on the Shuttle mission 120 in 2007. Like all but 2 missions, it was a successful flight where nothing went wrong. Although he was trained to be prepared for anything. Literally, the tiniest error could mean catastrophe.
As crew, we had serious problems. Our training was very tough, very serious. For example, at the time of launch, there were a number of malfunctions that could happen, and according to how they interacted between each other, a simple and a stupid thing could have a knock-on effect and lead to the destruction of the vehicle. As a member of the crew, you had to understand all these things. And there was this kind of game, let's call it a game, between the instructors who wanted to kill you and you, who responded successfully to all these provocations.
January 1986. Space Shuttle Challenger was originally set to launch from Kennedy Space Center on January the 22nd, 1986. but bad weather led to delays. The launch slipped from January 23rd, then 24th, and then 25th. Another weather delay and a technical problem with one of the door hatches pushed the launch back another 2 days. On January the 28th, the weather was still colder than usual for launching the shuttle. Alan MacDonald represented the Utah-based builder of the solid-fuel rocket boosters, Morton Thiokol, on site.
I can remember walking out of the Launch Control Center to my car after that, and I never felt wind so strong, and the sand was blowing into my contact lenses, and it actually stopped me at times, and I'd have to lean forward. I got to my car to go to my friend's house, and I wasn't there very long, and I got a phone call. The phone call was a fellow by the name of Bob Ebling that worked for me. And he said, Al, he says, we just been notified that some meteorologist in Orlando said, you know, these strong winds that canceled our launch today, that there's a real cold front behind that. And by tomorrow morning, it may be down as close as 18 degrees Fahrenheit as cold. I said, good grief, I'm really worried about whether these O-ring seals will operate at all at those kind of temperatures.
Back in Utah, the engineers were so worried about the effect of the cold on the O-rings that they asked MacDonald to get more detailed weather reports from NASA.
I said, fine, I'll get that information for you. But when I get it, here's what I want you to do. I want you to provide that to the engineers. I want them to put together a presentation of what we know and don't know, what our concerns are. And at the end of that presentation, I want you to make sure that the Vice President of Engineering comes on and makes a recommendation. What is the lowest temperature it is safe to launch? We have to do that.
Alan MacDonald got all the parties on board for a teleconference between engineers in Utah, those in Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and NASA management at Cape Canaveral. More than a dozen engineers faxed their charts and made a clear and unanimous recommendation. The shuttle should not be launched if the temperature was below 53 degrees Fahrenheit or 11.6 degrees Celsius, due to concerns about how the O-rings would perform.
At the end of their presentation, the Vice President of Engineering, a fellow by the name of Mr. Bob Lund, got on the network and said, based on what his engineers have presented here this evening, because they had to fax all those charts to both Huntsville and also to the Cape, he said, I would not recommend that we launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was primarily based on the experience we'd had 1 year earlier that concerned us. And frankly, I was shocked because I felt that that was a slam dunk. They would accept that and just postpone the launch. They immediately started questioning the basis for making such a recommendation based on the material presented.
Then, the unthinkable happened. Several top executives vetoed the engineers' recommendation in an offline caucus, giving NASA the green light to launch Challenger at a temperature that was just 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius. A few engineers protested, but were overruled, due in part to concerns about losing lucrative government contracts if the launch schedule were to fall further behind. NASA wanted the recommendation faxed to them in writing. Alan refused.
I did the smartest thing I ever did in my life. I told NASA I would not sign that recommendation. I feel we're taking risks that we should not take. It'll have to come from the plant, if it comes from anybody, but not me.
The O-rings were not the only concern. Alan told those gathered at the teleconference that high winds were gusting up to 70 knots and there was ice everywhere. All the while, NASA officials were pressing for the fax from Morton Thiokol.
At that point in time, they said, well, Al, you've brought up all these concerns that aren't really should be your concerns, but we'll pass them on in an advisory capacity only. Where is the fax from your boss?
The next day, The ice teams were busy knocking icicles off the shuttle and using an infrared pyrometer gun to get temperature readings that were entered into NASA logbooks. A later review of those logs showed the temperature near the failed solid rocket booster was below 28 degrees, or -2 degrees Celsius, much colder than the ambient air temperature of 31 degrees Fahrenheit, just below freezing point. It was shaded from the sun and exposed to westerly winds. In the meantime, the astronauts were preparing for launch, a complicated process with strict protocols to follow. Paolo Nespoli flew on the shuttle in 2007.
Qualche ora prima del lancio, 5-6 ore prima del lancio.
A few hours before the launch, 5 or 6 hours before launch, it's time to get dressed. We launch or launched with what is called a launch and entry suit, which is a pressurized suit that allows the crew to stay alive in case of loss of pressure inside the shuttle. So it began to be complicated with gloves, a helmet. To speak, you needed to use a communication system, which means that if 7 people all speak at the same time, it becomes incomprehensible. So you need discipline in terms of who speaks, what they say. So we put on the suit in the quarantine area. There are protocols to check the resistance to pressure of the suit. And from there, you go to the launch ramp using a special vehicle.
E da lì si esce con un veicolo speciale, si va alla rampa di lancio.
When I walked in, I heard the radio say it was 22 degrees Fahrenheit. I was carrying my briefcase and my headset because I was in the adjacent contractor support area of the Launch Control Center. And I went up to my computer console that monitors all the data that comes from the solid rocket boosters, but it also has an inset of NASA Select video of the launch. But it also has several other options for cameras to look at on the launch pad. So I started looking at these cameras and I saw this ice all over the place. Now, well, they're not going to launch this thing today, obviously.
But the comforting facts had arrived from Morton Thiokol bosses recommending NASA to proceed with the launch. The countdown was on. There was no turning back.
I was worried that it was cold, and I really felt that if the boosters would fail because of that issue of not sealing in the joint because it was too cold, that would all happen in the first 6 or 7 tenths of a second, and we would see a leak sprung, and that the whole thing would probably explode by the time it cleared the tower.
At 11:38, the shuttle lifted off.
9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
The relief at the successful liftoff of the Challenger space shuttle in January 1986 was short-lived, however.
It cleared the tower. I breathed a great sigh of relief. And it wasn't until 73 seconds later that this big explosion occurred.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
And everyone in there was shocked, including me, that I knew that wasn't survivable. And I could hear people sobbing actually in the background because I had my headset on, and all I could hear from the network was RTLS, RTLS from the Capcom, which meant return to launch site, return to launch site.
The 7 Challenger astronauts, Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judy Resnick, Ellison Anizuka, Ronald McNair, and payload specialists Krista McAuliffe and Gregory Jarvis, would never return to the launch site. For 2 hours, Mission Control was in top-secret lockdown as NASA scrambled to set up a failure team to find out what had gone wrong at 14,000 meters above the launch platform.
The Vice President Bush called and said that he was getting on a plane, and he was going to come and talk to everyone in the control room that evening, and he did. And he basically said that, you know, it's a horrible, tragic accident. We need to get to the bottom of it, figure out what happened so it doesn't happen again. But this is not going to stop the Space Shuttle program. We're going to get back to safe flight as soon as we can, and this is the team that's going to have to do it.
The tragedy was that a whole structure was set up in the United States whereby children sat and were assembled before their television screens right across the United States to watch the launch of Challenger. And Krista McAuliffe, their teacher in space, who was scheduled to carry out lessons from orbit while she was in space.
And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
The next day, the failure team gathered at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Though he hoped it was something else, McDonald suspected O-ring failure. The convincing and critical piece of data was a few seconds of film showing a puff of black smoke in the right booster in one of the aft section field joints.
My heart about sank. And I'll never forget calling home that evening, telling my wife that canceled plans, I wasn't going to be there. I didn't know how long I was going to be. And I knew I needed to do that, but my 3-year-old daughter answered the telephone, Megan, and she says, "Daddy, when are you coming home?" And I says, "Pretty soon, Megan, pretty soon." She says, "Daddy, when is the space shuttle going to go up?" And I couldn't answer, because she knew her daddy always came home after the space shuttle went up. And I said, "Pretty soon, Megan, pretty soon."
But how did NASA get to this low point in its history after the glory years of Apollo? And why did it take so many risks with the shuttle? NASA scientists were already studying plans to build a reusable space shuttle at the time the planning for the Apollo moon mission was in full swing. The goal was to drastically lower the cost of space flight. A program to build it was formally launched on January the 5th, 1972 by President Nixon.
When the shuttle was initially approved by Congress, NASA wanted as many users to get on board to justify it. And the Air Force was a big, powerful lobby in any space project. And so NASA went to the Air Force and said, "You can use the shuttle. We can replace all your conventional ballistic rockets for launching your military payloads, your spy satellites, your military weather satellites, your navigation satellites, and so on." The Air Force signed into this and said, "We can do amazing things if we have this enormous vehicle that can fly to any landing site across the United States on any orbit that it comes back from."
In the 4 decades of the United States Space Shuttle program, 355 men and women flew on 5 space shuttles in 135 missions. They launched cutting-edge satellites, sent spacecraft to explore Venus, Jupiter, and other far reaches of outer space, and contributed to building the International Space Station. Paolo Nespoli flew on the shuttle in 2007 to deliver the Harmony Utility Hub, the station's permanent living headquarters for astronauts.
The shuttle was an extremely complex vehicle. As an engineer, as I began studying the shuttle systems to become a mission specialist, I thought to myself, goodness, this is an extremely advanced vehicle. It was designed in the 1970s, but it is extremely complex. It looks as though it was designed to be complex. They couldn't design something simple. They designed it to use the full range of the engineer's imagination, using all their capacity.
But at the end of the day, they didn't realize that they built such a complex machine with such complex interactions between systems that they were impossible to manage.
Building the shuttle proved more complex and expensive than expected. The US Air Force, now NASA's main client, required a winged aircraft that a pilot could maneuver, protected by heat-absorbent tiles that did not have to be replaced for every mission. To launch satellites, the Air Force also demanded a huge cargo bay. The end result was a spaceplane that weighed more than 20,000 metric tons. The three main engines located aft of the cargo bay were fueled by a mix of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Each produced 200,000 kilos of thrust. They were gimbaled to control pitch, yaw, and roll.
The liquid fuel engines were soft engines. In fact, they were ignited 6 or 7 seconds before launch because they had to gain pressure. There were these turbine turbopumps that went and when these started, you'd feel the shuttle alive. It moved, and inside the cabin, you'd feel this movement because the engines had enough power to move the shuttle, but not to lift it off. At T0, the moment of launch, explosive bolts were ignited that kept the shuttle attached to the launch platform. They were ignited. The solid fuel boosters were ignited that are incredibly powerful, with such thrust that they give all their power in a millisecond. And at that moment, you feel a train hit your back, and suddenly you are thrown upwards.
Sentivi un treno che ti arrivava sulla schiena e improvvisamente ti buttava verso l'alto.
The largest solid propellant motors ever built, and the first to ever be used on a manned spacecraft, with a power pack that kicked the shuttle into space. Each booster was made of 11 individual weld-free steel segments, joined together with steel pins. Once assembled, each booster measured 35 meters long and 3.5 meters in diameter. The more than 450,000 kilos of propellant inside burned at a temperature of 3,200 degrees Celsius and generated a liftoff thrust of 1.2 million kilos. The boosters burned for 2 minutes in parallel with the main engines during the initial ascent, pushing the shuttle out of the atmosphere. But then, at about 39,000 meters above the Earth, the boosters separated from the external tank and fell into the Atlantic Ocean under huge parachutes, to be recovered and returned for reuse.
The equivalent of the energy contained in a shuttle is equivalent to a small atom bomb, so much so that they clear that area for kilometers and kilometers around the launch pad, because if anything happens, everything is razed to the ground. Where are you? Sitting on the atom bomb that is about to explode in a controlled fashion, shooting all this energy downwards and pushing, launching the shuttle into space.
The external tank weighed 35,000 kilos and contained 725,000 kilos of liquid oxygen and 102,000 kilos of liquid hydrogen. It is the only part of the shuttle not reused after each flight. Thrusters were located in the nose and tail segments, while orbiter maneuver pods located in blisters on either side of the vertical tail surface provided power to get the shuttle to rendezvous and onto the re-entry path. There was space for 7 to 8 crew members, the most ever to travel in space, housed in the pressurized nose section that combined oxygen and nitrogen to create a shirt-sleeve environment for the 2-week average duration of the mission. As NASA entered the digital era, avionics changed radically, with computers managing data from dozens of sensors in the fuselage and wings. The NASA Space Shuttle program was well underway by the 1970s and bringing thousands of jobs to communities across the country. Tenders went out, and the winning contractor for the solid fuel boosters of the shuttle was Morton Thiokol, based just north of the small town of Ogden, Utah. Much of the research and development behind the United States' most advanced weapons and satellite delivery systems and rocket research was happening here, in the remote, sage-covered hills along Highway 83, near the salt-encrusted edges of the Great Salt Lake. Today, near the sprawling former Morton Thiokol production site, a road sign points visitors to a rocket garden outside the plant. For 26 years, portions of the shuttle's solid fuel rockets were researched, developed, and constructed here, under the oversight of Alan MacDonald.
Well, the shuttle boosters were so large that we had to make them into segments and send the pieces as a segment to the Cape in Florida on a rail car. There's only a couple of lines that you can get to Kennedy without hitting bridges because they're about the largest thing you can put on a train. They're over 12 feet in diameter. Each the sections, and there's 4 of them you have to put together. You just kind of stack them up like beer cans on the mobile launch platform. They're sent down by rail. And when they are received down there and ready for assembly on the mobile launch platform, because they're stacking on top of it, there's a joint that is made to assemble the entire rocket booster. But in that joint, we have to make sure that the gases can't escape.
These enormous shock waves that go through the booster cause it to expand and then to bounce back. So they bow out and then bounce. And you cannot see this. It's fractional, but it's very meaningful inside those joints. And they realized that there could be flexing and movement inside those joints that would cause gas to escape between the sections in the field joints that the propellant was burning. So at ignition, you get this great convulsion of a great enormous button. It would literally push like pushing your elbows out on balloons. It would cause it, and then the balloons push back. So the sheer strength of the steel casing caused it to hold up and stabilize at that point. But in the critical area where the gas is shooting through the gap, you need to have 2 O-rings that go right around the joint to seal it.
During launch, the joint had to withstand pressures of more than 63 kilos per square centimeter and temperatures of more than 530 degrees Celsius. The O-ring provided the pressure resistance, while a zinc chromate putty applied to the interior of the joint provided the temperature resistance.
And it's what we call a tang and clevis joint, much like a tongue and groove in a hardwood floor. And because of that, we have to put something to seal the gases in. And the way we do that, we have 2 O-ring seals, much like you have washers in your hose or in your sink to prevent the water from leaking. This prevents the gases from getting out. And the reason there's 2 of them is that this was considered such a critical function, we had to provide redundancy wherever it was possible to do that. In case one of them failed, the other one then acted as a backup to prevent failure, because it was well known that any gas leak out of one of these joints would be catastrophic.
The O-rings that sealed the joints were made of a vulcanized rubber substance called Viton. But from the very beginning of the shuttle program, engineers were concerned about the performance of the O-rings and their ability to seal properly in cold temperatures.
The Viton O-ring is a fluorocarbon rubber, and one of its primary characteristics, why it was selected for this type of an application, is that it is very tough. It was really worried that these huge segments that weigh over 300,000 pounds each, when they're pulled together, that if they were not quite lined up properly, it may cut the O-ring during the assembly. And we found that this material was by far the best to resist that from ever happening. So it was a rubber material, but it was a fairly hard rubber material.
It was vital that the seal remain efficient for the whole of the flight. But temperature could change the behavior of this basic material, which worried engineers early on.
One of the characteristics of any rubber material is that since we're using them in a compressed state, we're squeezing them into these joints in a compressed state, and we do that because we knew that that joint opened a little bit when it pressurized. So there was enough compression in the O-ring squeezed in there that when it did open, it would maintain contact with the other surface as it was opened. Now, the characteristic of doing that is called resiliency of material. It's kind of like a wet sponge. You take a wet sponge and you put your finger on it and you start to release it. You'll notice your finger stays right with the sponge, but you take that sponge and throw it into the freezer and take it out and push your finger on it. It leaves a dent and it won't recover until it finally warms up.
Engineers analyzing the shuttle and its boosters upon each return from space had noticed erosion of some O-rings and menacing black soot around the O-rings, a phenomenon they called blow-by, because it meant hot gases were leaking and blowing by the joint.
In that final year, full year of Shuttle, 5 of the 7 Shuttle flights demonstrated blow-throughs on these boosters. We'd never have known this if those boosters hadn't been recovered and inspected in detail for post-flight analysis. But the engineers to a man said, we are playing with dice and we're running across a freeway blindfold in rush hour and we're going to lose some crews.
It actually was noted a problem with these joints way back into the second flight of the shuttle, STS-2, where in disassembly of one of the field joints they noted some erosion on the O-ring, which meant that gas got down there to burn it. And the way the joint was designed, we actually had material ahead of the joint in that gap. It was really a zinc chromate putty loaded with asbestos to try to thermally isolate the O-ring so we'd never see gas.
A launch during a record cold snap in January 1985 gave engineers a scare.
Just a year before the Challenger launch in January 1985, when we recover these boosters, we always pull them apart and examine these joints. And this was the first time we noticed that we actually had this condition of blow-by in the field joint that we have observed. In fact, we saw it in a joint, one joint in each booster, the left and right. So there was 2 joints, very similar, that indicated that some gas actually got past the first O-ring, but stopped by the second one. That happened because at that time, that was the coldest launch we had ever experienced. And we determined that the O-ring temperature was about 53 degrees Fahrenheit on that particular launch.
Then in April of 1985, NASA executed 2 launches in the same month for the first time ever. Again, engineers saw that O-rings had burned and eroded. It was an alarming trend.
Because we were lucky in that we had seen this behavior in the nozzle joint, not the field joint. Because had we seen something similar in the field joint, we all felt very uncomfortable that it would have leaked all the way out and caused a catastrophic failure. So we formed an O-ring seal task force right after observing this nozzle problem to look at all the sealing mechanisms, every one of them in the solid rocket booster, and see what we'd recommend to do.
They often ask me if I ever felt in danger, if I was afraid of getting aboard this atom bomb that was about to explode, given the accidents that had happened in the past. And my answer is absolutely not. And I don't think I'm an exception. No one who worked on the shuttle felt in danger. On the one hand, because we had been trained by NASA that took us every place where every part was built, allowed us to speak with every technician, and we realized that the system was incredibly strong, incredibly careful. Things were done with great care. And as far as I'm concerned, I almost came to feel that I was the weak link.
As NASA prepared to launch a top-secret payload from the shuttle for the Air Force in the summer of 1985, the team redesigned the rocket boosters to make them lighter and reduce the risk of O-ring failure, and made a proposal to NASA to fund the same changes to all rocket boosters used on the shuttles. But NASA rejected it. 7 of the 9 shuttle flights in the year prior to the Challenger explosion had shown warning signs that concerned engineers enough to write the memo to NASA. But their proposals were rejected. Few in NASA management wanted to slow the ambitious launch schedule. On the 28th of January 1986, one of the many complex systems failed, with catastrophic consequences for the crew and for NASA. 73 seconds into the flight, just when the shuttle was vibrating and flexing at its maximum, the flame broke through the seal and blew a huge hole in the external tank, aided by wind shear. The disintegrating external tank caused the shuttle to veer from its altitude, increasing the aerodynamic forces that ripped the shuttle apart. The boosters were thrown off, and the crew capsule catapulted toward the sea. Based on emergency oxygen supplies used on board and other manual switches turned on and off during their descent, the crew were likely alive and perhaps conscious for over 2 minutes until their craft tore apart upon hitting the Atlantic Ocean at 330 kilometers per hour. Alan MacDonald was on the failure team that sought to understand what went wrong.
When I was in the failure team at NASA, and I found the data that indicated had a problem with cold temperatures in the very joint that failed that kind of fit this puzzle. And the next question is, well, but even then it doesn't explain why it didn't blow up when I would expect it to blow up between 6 and 7/10 of a second. And so I asked immediately at that point in time, has anybody ever looked at the cameras of liftoff, not flight? And so they called down to the Cape, and the guy told me they'll pull one of those, and they pulled it. I says, make sure it's looking exactly where you see this fire coming out in flight. So I said, go find the one that's closest. And they did, and about 10 minutes later they came back to us, oh my God, we see a puff of smoke.
But if the O-ring failure was to blame, why did the shuttle not explode immediately, as engineers had predicted? They would later discover that after the O-rings vaporized, the hot gas of the burning aluminium oxide hit the cold steel and solidified right where the O-rings had burned, creating a fragile ceramic seal which held right up until the order to throttle up.
The winds aloft were so high that as the bracing strut that held the booster to the side of the tank became weaker, it tore the booster around on a pivoting arc and pushed the nose of the booster into the top of the 2 tanks, the oxygen tank. Already the flame coming through from one of the punctured segments that had overwhelmed the O-rings was operating like a blowtorch to open up the side of the very thin aluminium hydrogen tank. But when the booster pivoted and pushed in the nose into the oxygen tank, that caused a Roman candle effect, which was a great convulsive, it wasn't an actual explosion, not like a bomb going off. There was a great convulsive release of energy which punched the boosters off from the side of the tank and ripped apart components of the orbiter. The strongest part is the pressurized compartment, and that pressurized compartment remained intact.
MacDonald and engineers pored over the logbooks from the ice teams, but NASA managers said that the instruments had not been properly calibrated and increased all the temperatures they submitted to the Presidential Commission. Something was amiss.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind it was a cover-up. They covered up the low temperature data. They had tremendous pressures on their launch schedule, both from a political standpoint to support their out-year budget and immediate ones to do what they already had on their plate, which was nearly impossible. And I think because of that, they did as much as they could to try to cloud this issue and make it sound more difficult and technical and hard to understand than it really should have been.
As NASA officials from Marshall Space Center were preparing their presentation for the Commission, Alan raised objections and eventually put together a separate presentation of his own.
As part of the failure team, I started mentioning and questioning some of their conclusions and data, especially the cold temperature stuff, and that they were still looking at things that I thought were not only impossible, they're ridiculous. I said, if you look at the films, you can tell that can't possibly be, like lightning strikes and all kinds of funny things. And so I raised my hand and said, well, I made an assessment. I'll be willing to present something. And even stated that I really believe that a major contributor was whatever caused this cold temperature on this one joint. And that's why that joint failed and the other 5 did not. And I'm not a big believer of coincidences. And you could have heard a pin drop. There wasn't a single person supported me. There wasn't a single person that challenged me or a single person that offered another possible scenario what caused it.
A presidential commission, the Rogers Commission, was tasked with investigating how the disaster happened. Just weeks into the Commission's inquiry, there were suspicions that NASA officials and contractors were not telling the whole truth. Commission member and famed theoretical physicist Richard Feynman turned their focus to the resiliency of the O-rings.
Well, I took this stuff that I got out of your seal and I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it doesn't stretch back, it stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees. I believe that has some significance for our problem.
At multiple hearings, MacDonald raised his hand and told the Commission exactly what had transpired about how the decision not to launch got changed.
And I remember Neil Armstrong says, yeah, I think we need to hear from Mr. MacDonald to cause this meeting to be here in the first place. He says he has more to talk about. And I told him about all that transpired after it got changed. And I'll never forget, I could hardly keep composed, so I had done it. Dr. Sally Ride got up out of the bench, come running over to me, gave me a big hug and said, God, I'm glad somebody finally leveled with this commission. That took a hell of a lot of guts.
Upon return to work, however, MacDonald found he had been moved out of his prestigious engineering job.
And so what's my job? And they said, well, we're forming this new group on program planning, and your job's going to be head of scheduling. I said, scheduling? What the hell can I schedule? I don't build anything. What we build isn't what we have now. He goes, well, that's for you to figure out. It was clearly a non-job, hoping I would quit.
With time on his hands, Alan went to conferences in the field. At one event, one of the generals who was head of Air Force Space Command was surprised to see him and found out what had happened.
He said, you ought to be spending all of your time figuring out why the shuttle failed the way it did. I said, I'm not doing that anymore. He said, what do you mean anymore? You're a member of the failure team, aren't you? I said, I was, but I got taken off. You got taken off? When the hell did that happen? I said, I think it was exactly one day after I testified before you people. He said, you're kidding me. I said, no, I'm not. He said, well, that's bullshit. We'll fix that problem.
Alan MacDonald went on to join a super task force aimed at redesigning the shuttle to restore it to safe flight. The shuttle flew more than 100 successful flights after the redesign. The failure to stop the Challenger launch has become a case study for the dangers of groupthink, desensitization to risk, and the danger of putting cost-cutting and schedule deadlines over safety.
People that have to make good decision managers, and they're sometimes very tough decisions to make, should never feel comfortable that they've made the best decision unless they've used every tool in their toolkit. And the biggest tool they have in their toolkit is the brain power of the people they work with and work for them. And if they don't create an atmosphere where those people feel very comfortable to tell them issues or concerns that they may have, they've lost the most valuable data they can to make these tough decisions.
The failure of NASA to redesign or fix engineering problems when they were first raised led to a rationalization of grave risk as acceptable, especially when launch schedules and cost-cutting measures were bearing down.
But we were charging a fraction of what it was costing, and that was driving the upward momentum of launching every time on time. And that was the structural political beginning of the inevitable reduction of safety criteria. That's when we began to eat away at the edges of safety, and risk aversion became risk acceptability. And there were technical lessons and signs that were coming from even the very second shuttle mission that we could lose a crew on those boosters.
Managers have to be receptive to the concerns of engineers, who must be clear and courageous about reporting them. The pressure on the workforce to save money, time, and contracts ultimately cost 7 astronauts' lives and hastened the demise of America's space shuttle, which was retired in 2011. It remains to be seen if the US can overcome aerospace design challenges and political feuding to put women and men back into space from US soil once again, never forgetting the crucial engineering lessons learned from the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. It is the height of the summer holiday season of the year 2000, and Europe's economy is booming. Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport is bustling with tourists coming and going. 100 passengers are about to board the Concorde for a transatlantic flight. Most of them are from Germany, en route for New York City, where they will board a Caribbean cruise to Ecuador. The idyllic career of a plane that was considered the epitome of elegance, speed, and luxury travel is about to come to a tragic end.
C'est vraiment la définition, on peut dire que c'est quelque part la définition même de l'accident.
It is the definition, one can say it is the definition of an accident that happens when conditions are standard, normal, not catastrophic. The weather, the wind. Everything suggests a normal flight, and in the space of less than a few seconds, overall maybe, the whole thing was over in a minute. We get one of the great catastrophes of aviation.
Une des grandes catastrophes, on va dire, de l'histoire de l'aviation.
It was a whole chain of events, an error chain of events, and it was the cumulative effect of all these errors that led to that accident. It was nothing to do with design weaknesses in Concorde.
These are the only moving images ever recorded of the Concorde on fire. It is clear that the giant of the skies is struggling to take to the air. Aboard, the passengers must know there's a serious problem. The charismatic captain, Christian Marty, is struggling with the controls to keep it in the air. A few seconds later, the Hôtelissimo Les Relais Bleus is a pile of burning rubble. Concorde Flight 4590 has crashed into it, destroying it in a ball of fire from the burning jet fuel. a sequence of apparently insignificant events ended up killing all 109 people on board and 4 on the ground. What actually did go wrong in the afternoon of the 25th of July 2000? July 25th, 2000. At the controls of the Concorde, in the cramped cockpit of the supersonic airliner, is Christian Marty, 54 years old and the first man to windsurf across the Atlantic. He is a man of experience, a charismatic pilot. Aviation journalist Bernard Chabert knew him well.
L'équipage était commandé par un garçon absolument phénoménal et remarquable, Christian.
The crew was captained by an absolutely phenomenal guy who was both a high-level sportsman, the first man to cross the Atlantic on a windsurf from Europe to Antilles. I knew him a bit. I'd flown with him. My wife, who was a hostess with Air France, had flown with him often. He was truly remarkable.
À cette époque-là, avait souvent volé avec lui. C'était absolument quelqu'un de totalement exceptionnel.
First Officer Jean Marcot and Flight Engineer Gilles Jardineau make up one of the most experienced flight crews in the business. It is about 3 in the afternoon, and they are ready for takeoff. John Hutchinson flew the Concorde for 15 years.
Somewhere before they requested the taxi clearance, the captain had requested the full length of the runway. The first few hundred meters of the runway were actually being resurfaced, and the tower, I presume, reminded him of this, and he said, no, I realise that, but I still want the full length of the runway. So they cleared him for taxiing for a takeoff for the full runway length.
The aircraft begins to taxi down the runway. It has started from very far back, as it will need all the runway for takeoff. But the plane is overloaded and full of fuel.
Just to make it clear, the captain, for whatever reason, had decided to take 2 tons of taxi fuel, which is a lot of taxi fuel, and that was located in tank 11 at the back here. And that 2 tons of taxi fuel has to be burnt off before you start the takeoff. That's not fuel that you're going to take into the air with you. That's fuel that's used for taxiing only.
It needs to reach a speed known technically as V for velocity 1. To do this, all 4 engines need to be at full power.
V1 is the decision speed below which, if you have an emergency, you reject the takeoff and you can then stop the aeroplane on the remaining length of runway. Any emergency after V1, you have to take that emergency into the air with you and deal with it once you're safely climbing away and got the airplane fully under control.
The pilot pushes the throttles forward to get the 4 afterburners pushing at maximum power. But then Marty receives devastating information. There is a fire trailing the left wing, just as the co-pilot announces they have reached the speed to begin takeoff, known as VR, rotation speed. Exactly at that moment, an Air France jumbo stops at the edge of the runway waiting to cross. The French president is aboard.
Its trajectory and in its short flight took it diverging away from the runway to the left-hand side. And this Concorde ended up actually flying over the top of the 747.
One of the 4 wheels now rolled on the concrete of the runway. Rubbing against the concrete, the aircraft deviated from its straight path. The crew then corrected this lurch.
It's very probable that in their minds and in the mind of the captain, Christian Marty, they understood that one of the tires had burst on one side that was causing this lurching. But since he was deviating from his trajectory and he had reached takeoff speed, he decided to take off.
Now he needs to get the landing gear up to reduce drag and get the aircraft flying and bring it back under control. The landing gear does not come up. On the ground, the control tower looks on aghast as the Concorde leaves the runway but fails to reach cruising altitude. The last words spoken aboard are "Le Bourget," as the pilot attempts to keep the plane flying long enough to get to the airfield to the south. These were the last clear words heard in the cockpit of Air France Flight 4590 before it crashed into the hotel.
La dernière tentative de l'équipage, puisqu'il y a en bout de piste.
The last attempt on the part of the pilot, since at the end of the Roissy-Charles de Gaulle runway, a little to the left, is the Le Bourget airport. So the last thing we hear from the crew was that, out of desperation, they wanted to turn to Le Bourget. That was just there. They were just 15 seconds away, but in any case, arriving on the Le Bourget airport, they would have crashed anyway because the landing gear, due to hydraulic problems, as they are controlled by the hydraulic energy of the aircraft, the undercarriage had started to retract and was blocked halfway and would not have been able to resist the weight of the aircraft, and the aircraft would probably have broken up on touching the ground.
L'avion se serait probablement disloqué en touchant le sol.
There were no survivors. A sequence of tiny errors caused the only ever Concorde crash, but also brought the curtain down on one of the greatest legends of aerospace. Toulouse, France, February 1969. The Concorde supersonic airliner takes to the sky for the very first time. This aircraft doesn't only push engineering boundaries, picking up where Nazi Germany had left off, but political ones too.
Quand on regarde un avion d'aujourd'hui, on regarde le résultat.
When we see an aircraft today, we see the work of German aeronautical engineers, the swept wing, hyperlift with wing slats, jets attached to the wings, jet propulsion itself. All this was begun in Germany, but also at the same time was begun in Great Britain. So the British aircraft industry was in the forefront, especially in the area of performance.
En pointe avancée, surtout dans le domaine des performances.
It is the first aircraft to be built by two nations, under a deal signed by France's General Charles de Gaulle and the British government under Harold Wilson.
And if it succeeds and Concorde goes into service, as we all hope, it will mean that in one single aircraft development, the work of the last 50 years will have been doubled in efficiency. It's an astonishing project, Concorde, from this point of view.
Anglais comme Français avaient pensé qu'il fallait essayer d'aller au-delà de la vitesse du son.
The British, like the French, had decided that the next step was to go faster than the speed of sound, to be supersonic, and the British had designed a plane that looked overall like what Concorde would become, and the French, independently, had designed an aircraft that looked enormously like what Concorde actually became. And then the two projects were costed, and they realized that the project cost more than either nation could afford. So a certain financial realism was accepted, which led to the principle that if we couldn't do something by ourselves, let's join forces, and we'll get there.
Unissons-nous et essayons d'y arriver.
The aircraft itself was revolutionary. It built on precious experience gathered by Germany during the war in the use of jet propulsion and the original Delta wing, which helped lift the plane in takeoff and limit drag in flight.
Sur Concorde, à cause de l'aile delta. On avait choisi l'aile delta parce que c'est la forme d'aile
On Concorde, the delta wing was chosen because it allows for very high speeds, supersonic speeds, Mach 2 for example, but also because it's a wing that is light, and from the designer's point of view, the wing needed to fly, but also be light and strong, very, very strong from an aerodynamic point of view. So they discovered, the Germans first, and then after the war, everyone discovered that the delta wing was the most elegant and technically reasonable solution to reach very high speeds.
Une des manières les plus élégantes et techniquement raisonnables d'atteindre les très hautes vitesses.
The way this wing created lift was somewhat different from a conventional wing. When you're talking about slow speeds, and by that I mean speeds below about 270 knots. 270 knots and below, with this high angle of attack that you would have to be flying at that low speed. The way you were creating lift at those low speeds was not by having a laminar flow over the wing surface, but by creating a massive rolling vortex over each wing, and it was the low pressure within that vortex on each wing that gave you the lift.
The Concorde's wing shape was a modified delta tested for months in wind tunnels to get just the right shape for maximum aerodynamic efficiency. To minimize drag, it soared so high that its maximum cruise altitude was 18,300 meters, or 60,000 feet. Passengers could see the curvature of the Earth. It had an average cruise speed of Mach 2.02, 2,150 kilometers per hour, or 1,330 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of conventional aircraft. The Concorde also had something no other plane had, the iconic droop nose. This special snoot was designed so the pilots could lower the front cone for better visibility during takeoff and landing, which had to have a very high angle of attack due to the plane's design.
Well, there were various positions for the nose. It was the nose fully up and the visor up, and that's, as you see it here in this model, streamlined, beautiful streamlined shape for high-speed flight. The first stage was to lower the visor, the heat shield, down into the nose cone, where it remained stowed. You'd then lower the nose to 5 degrees, and that was the position that that you had the nose for takeoff, for taxiing around the airfield, and for flight in the airport area, in the terminal area. And then the final position was the nose fully down at 12.5 degrees, and you only used that position for landing.
The other feature of the Concorde was its 4 huge Olympus jet engines designed by Rolls-Royce. They provided 17,000 kilos of thrust each with afterburners, enough to push the aircraft to Mach 2, more than twice the speed of sound, or 2,146 kilometers per hour.
Quand on va plus vite que la vitesse du son, il faut commencer par...
When you go faster than the speed of sound, you have to slow down the airflow because the engine will never accept the airflow. It will refuse to take in air at supersonic speeds. It chokes and then stops. So on the Concorde, over the space of just 3 meters, you have to take in air traveling at over 2,000 kilometers an hour and reduce its speed to 900 kilometers an hour over the space of just 3 meters. So the intake is equipped with moving panels that reduce the overpressure that reduces the speed of the air and allows the engine to take in air at a usable speed.
Ralentir l'écoulement de l'air et permettre au moteur d'avaler de l'air respirable.
Flying above 50,000 feet, basically you're above all the things that cause turbulence. You're above the jet streams, you're above the thunderstorms. So you're flying in this very calm, tranquil atmosphere, and it's the most uncanny feeling, actually. I used to pinch myself in disbelief almost on every flight I ever did, right through to my last flight. Here I was, sitting there, doing 1,350 miles an hour, Mach 2, 55, 56, 58,000 feet, and you had no sensation of speed at all. It was almost as though you felt you were just hanging motionless in space and waiting for Mother Earth to spin around for your destination to arrive below, and you then throttle back, re-enter and land. It was that sort of a feeling.
However, not all of John's flights were that comfortable. One in particular remains in his memory.
We were flying from Washington to London, and we were, 55, 56,000 feet, Mach 2, and I'm just about to eat a nice piece of steak, and suddenly the airplane started shaking violently, and I mean really shaking me around. And for a moment I thought, gosh, this is turbulence. And then I thought, no, that's not turbulence. Being a bit slow on the uptake. I realized then that it was what we call an engine surge at Mach 2. And there's a drill for that. And the first item of the drill is to close all 4 throttles, which is fine. It stops all the banging and the thumping and the shaking, but it's what's driving you along at Mach 2. So the deceleration is quite dramatic, actually.
Fortunately, there is a way of overriding the aircraft computer, and the Concorde crew in question came up with an idea to avoid slowing the plane dramatically.
We started this drill, and the flight engineer, who was a very switched-on chap, a very good friend of mine called Bill Brown, he spotted that the variable geometry intake for the number 3 engine, for some reason or another, had driven itself fully shut. It was in a position it should not have been in, and consequently the number 3 engine was complaining like mad. And he said, look, instead of going through the whole drill, can I just hard select the computer, the alternate computer for controlling that engine? And I said, Bill, if you think that's going to work, go for it. And he hard selected the other computer, and we then very, very carefully opened the throttle, number 3 throttle up, and it was all fine. We opened up the symmetrical partner, the number 2, and it was all fine. Opened up the outboards, and we resumed Mach 2 and carried on towards London.
In order to stop it on the runways of the world, thrust reversers were installed, bucket-like doors that closed behind the engine nozzles to push the jet flow forward. Today, it takes 7 hours to fly from London to New York. The Concorde could make the trip in just over 3 hours. The price tag was in proportion, over $11,000 round trip, and the service on board was touted as impeccable, a stratospheric, supersonic cocktail party in the air.
I think the regular users of Concorde, your Rupert Murdochs, your David Frosts, they used it because it saved them time. It wasn't about comfort. If you want comfort, go first class. I'm not going to pretend that that Concorde offered comfort in the way that you can get great comfort in a first class cabin in a modern airliner. But it got you from A to B pretty damn quickly, and that's why people used it. It saved them time and saved them money as a consequence.
Cet avion avait un intérêt évidemment pour simplement ceux qui devaient travailler à New York, mais vous prenez cet avion à 11 heures du matin.
This aircraft was interesting for people who had to work in New York. You'd take it at 11 a.m. in Paris, you'd get to New York at 9 a.m., you'd have a whole day of work, you'd retake the Air France, not the Concorde, but a good 747 at 8:30 p.m., you'd sleep in the plane, and you'd be in court by 9 a.m. in Paris. So it was unheard of to travel, spend a day in New York, and continue the next day in Paris without being tired.
Et continuer la journée d'après à Paris, et en n'étant pas fatigué.
However, the Concorde was designed to maximize fuel tanks because of the huge consumption needed to fly at that speed over vast distances. The whole wing, narrow as it was in fact a fuel tank.
Dans l'aile, les réservoirs.
Inside the wings, due to the geometry of the wing on Concorde, the fuel tanks are deep down the wing, while on traditional wings they are long and laterally along the wings, whereas delta wings are deep.
Alors que là, les ailes delta sont profondes.
Concorde was fast, but also a heavy gas guzzler, required a specially trained crew, and was annoyingly recognizable to those on the ground below for its massive sonic boom, strong enough to damage windows. The Concorde was vulnerable in other areas too. The tyres had to withstand the enormous pressure of the 4 engines pushing at full power to take off. Over the years, the tyre specifications were improved, especially after a non-fatal incident in 1979 at Dulles Airport in Washington. Almost all orders for the design were cancelled by 1976 as ban the boom backlash over the Concorde's unmistakable sonic boom mounted. Eventually, only Air France and British Airways ever flew the Concorde.
Les Anglais, ils avaient une ligne qui était très fructueuse, plus fructueuse que la ligne française.
The British had a very profitable route, more profitable than the French route. The problem with this plane was essentially that it was not produced in large numbers, so it couldn't be developed over time. And a plane that can't be developed is stopped earlier than a plane that is constantly developed, such as the 747 that looks exactly the same as the original plane, but today is completely different internally, with the mechanics, the avionics, nothing is the same. It's completely different because the plane was developed. The Concorde was not developed, so it had to stop earlier than other planes.
L'avion s'est développé. Le Concorde ne s'est pas développé. Donc il fallait forcément qu'il s'arrête plus tôt que d'autres.
Both British Airways and Air France continued their regular and costly transatlantic flights until 2003, 3 years after the crash of Flight 4590. They also rented out Concordes to premium travel agencies. Flight 4590 had been rented by German cruise company Peter Dielmann Cruises. Most of the 100 passengers were headed to New York for a cruise to Ecuador.
Well, first of all, I should say that the airplane was delayed because there was a problem with the thrust reverser, and the captain, quite properly and correctly, decided to delay the flight until that thrust reverser problem had been fixed. And it delayed the airplane by, I can't remember, by about an hour, something like that.
On the 25th of July 2000, the passengers were due to board at 1:35 p.m. But there was a delay. Engine number 4 had a problem with the thrust reverser. It was just the first hitch of a sequence of errors and misfortunes that led to the crash. Over and beyond the extra taxi fuel, the passengers had more bags than expected.
Half an hour or so before the rescheduled departure time, the dispatcher came up onto the flight deck and announced that there were 19 bags that they couldn't take with them. And the captain said, why? And the dispatcher said, well, because you'll be overweight. And the captain said, well, is there physically room to put those bags somewhere? And he said, yes, in the cargo hold at the back, which is located right there, that cargo hold. And there's 19 bags which were never weighed, were stuck into the airplane.
One of the wheels on the left undercarriage had been replaced and was missing a spacer, a tool used to keep the wheels aligned in a single direction. And the fuel tanks were full to over the maximum takeoff weight, due to the extreme speed and fuel consumption the crew had planned to get the passengers to their destination as fast as possible.
The fuel tanks were overfilled. All these tanks in the wing were overfilled so that there was no airspace left in the tanks at all. I guess the only reason you can say that he did that was because he wanted as much fuel on board the airplane as possible, which actually doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you carry extra fuel, you burn something like 30 to 40% of that fuel just for the privilege of carrying it, because it's extra weight. So it's a sort of law of diminishing returns, carrying extra fuel.
It was a full flight, an overweight aircraft with a tyre that might be unstable. But now, even more factors contributed to the catastrophe.
As they started to line up on the runway. They had 1,200 kilos of fuel located here in Tank 11 that shouldn't have been there. And they'd got the 600-700 kilos of baggage located back here, which shouldn't have been there. We're talking about 1 3/4 tons, maybe nearly 2 tons of weight that was well after the center of gravity. It put the airplane over the maximum structural takeoff weight and put it in a situation where the takeoff was being commenced with its C of G position, center of gravity position, aft of the approved limits.
Marty requested not only the full length of the runway, but was also allocated a runway close to the terminal building. Marty had not noticed that the wind direction had changed.
They not only accepted this clearance on 26 left in this overweight situation with the center of gravity after the aft limits, they also accepted a clearance with a tailwind, an 8-knot tailwind. The airplane, when you factor in the tailwind, was probably something like 6 to 7 tons over the weight it should have been at.
Quand on dépasse la composante vent-arrière,
when you go beyond the integrated factors of rear wind, mass, temperature, and a lot of other parameters, you change direction and you take off the other way round, into the wind. These are the super basics in aviation. So that day, if the aircraft took off, it took off because calculations had been done beforehand, again and again, shown to the crew who validated them. So there was nothing strange about taking off that day with that weight and the tailwind and so forth.
Au poids de l'avion, avec la composante vent arrière, etc.
As he sped up the runway, something else happened that Captain Marty had no control over.
At this stage, the airplane was actually steering remorselessly off the left-hand side of the runway. He wasn't able to keep it straight on the center line of the runway. And the reason for that was that he wouldn't have known this, of course, but the front right-hand wheel on the left-hand undercarriage leg had run over this piece of metal left by a Continental Airlines DC-10. It had sliced off a 4.5 kilo lump of rubber, which had gone slamming into the underside of the wing by tank number 5 and caused that tank to rupture.
L'avion a roulé. Le train principal, le bogie
The aircraft, the main undercarriage, the bogie, ran over the metal strip that literally cut the tire. It's titanium. It is a hard metal, light but hard.
Un métal extrêmement solide, léger mais solide.
There was no airspace in that fuel tank to absorb the energy of the shockwave that was caused by the impact of this 4.5 kilo lump of rubber slamming into the underside of the wing with considerable force.
Le choc.
The shock produced by this enormous chunk of rubber, thrown up with enormous energy, created a system of shock waves inside the fuel tank and eventually hit the bottom of the tank. The jet fuel began pouring out. And since it was takeoff, the afterburners of the engines were on. It all caught fire because they were vaporized due to the speed of takeoff. So the fuel was pouring out, but vaporized very fast. It all caught fire. The flames went back up to the wing.
The spacer was missing on that undercarriage truck, and it skewed the wheels around because there's nothing now to keep the wheels locked in proper fore and aft alignment, and it was physically steering the airplane off the left-hand side of the runway. And the consequence of that was that the airplane was actually rotated not at 199 knots, but at about 183, 184 knots, something like 15 knots too early. And I guess that was because the captain could see that he was going off the side of the runway.
La pratique, c'est de décoller.
The protocol is to take off, go around the runway, and take a little time to empty the fuel tanks in order to land at the right landing weight. So there comes a time when taking off is obligatory.
They had passed the decisive moment. They were required to take off, and that's what they did.
Il leur fallait décoller, c'est ce qu'ils ont fait.
The crew reacted with the standard procedure in the event of fire, without knowing what had happened, however.
I believe that that engine was shut down unilaterally by the flight engineer. He'd seen this fire warning, which was a fire warning, but it wasn't a conventional engine fire. It was a fire warning caused by an overheated engine because this blowtorch of fuel was going right past the engine intake and overheating the engine. And that triggered off this fire warning. And he then just carried out a fire drill. He shut the engine down, fired the extinguishers without telling the captain at all. And this was conducted at about 25 feet radio altimeter height.
The intense fire began eroding the trailing edge of the sail-like wing, precisely the control surface that he needed to lift the aircraft and straighten out. Flight 459 Vogt took to the air just in front of President Chirac's jumbo jet, and these pictures were taken by one of the passengers aboard.
So that day, Air France came within 20 feet of one of their Concordes, hitting one of their 747s with a whole lot of passengers, plus the President of France and his wife on board. And I think that would have been a catastrophe from which no airline could possibly have survived. The media attention would have just been frenetic.
Marty ordered the undercarriage up, but the plane refused. He had everything against him. He could not turn, so his co-pilot suggested flying to Le Bourget, just a few kilometers away. It was too late. These are the only moving images of the Concorde just after takeoff and already engulfed in flames. Flight 459 Vogt collapsed onto the Hotel Hôtelissimo Les Relais Bleus. All 9 crew, the 100 passengers, and 4 people working in the Hôtelissimo were killed. The hotel was reduced to rubble. Investigators arrived on the scene and began putting together a picture of what went wrong. Over the following weeks, the wreck of the aircraft and hotel were piled up in a nearby hangar in the hope that these twisted pieces of metal might reveal the cause of the disaster. The passenger list was examined, and although there were items of luggage whose owners could not be identified, investigators excluded terrorism. They checked the thrust reverser that had been changed and had caused a delay in the flight, but found nothing wrong with it. Investigators also examined the runway from which the aircraft took off, searching for clues. And this is where the first element came to light. A huge chunk of the left tire was found on the runway. Concorde operators began mounting reinforced tires after the earlier incident in 1979 at Dulles Airport, Washington, D.C., but French investigators would later find the Concorde's tires burst 57 different times before the 2000 crash.
There was an incident, well, one I can remember quite clearly, where a Concorde had taken off from New York. It wasn't me, actually. And the tower called this Concorde up after it had got airborne, said, "Is everything okay?" And they said, "Why?" And this, as far as we know, yes, why? And they said, "Well, there's a lot of rubber on the runway." Right, well, we've got no symptoms of anything wrong on the airplane at all. And the airplane carried on to New York. It landed at New York, got to the British Airways terminal there, and when they checked it out, a tire had blown during the takeoff, and a whole lot of rubber had been ingested through the engine and just spat out of the back end, and the engine had kept running all the way across to New York.
They are tires designed to withstand landings at 400 kilometers an hour. These tires are not only thick but reinforced. The rubber is incredibly solid and dense.
There was no apparent reason, however, for this tire to burst, until investigators also found this twisted piece of metal on the runway, which, amazingly, corresponded to a cut on the tire. It did not take long for the investigators to identify where the piece of metal came from. A Continental Airlines transatlantic flight took off from the same runway just a few minutes beforehand. On inspection in its hangar in the United States, the titanium strip of engine cowling lining was missing. It had been poorly manufactured and even more poorly attached.
L'accident est totalement imprévisible. C'est un avion qui roule.
The accident is totally unpredictable. The aircraft rolled over a piece from a Continental Airlines plane, a titanium strip, that belonged to the thrust reverser. And, incredibly, this piece came off. And it can happen, but it twisted in the wind and fell to the runway. And fell like a razor blade supported on each end, and when the plane rolled over it, it was inevitable that the tire burst.
De chaque côté, et l'avion roulant sur cette lamelle en titane, évidemment, ne peut qu'exploser un pneu.
But just the tire bursting would not have caused the Concorde to burst into flames so catastrophically. Investigators also began combing the wreckage looking for other clues. They found that the forward bulwark of the wing fuel tank, number 5, had burst, which had caused a massive spill of fuel onto the wing that caught fire. From that moment on, the flight was doomed.
L'avion a commencé à embarquer. Il a été contré aux commandes de vol, mais l'incendie a également s'est propagé.
The aircraft began to lurch sideways, which was compensated for by the flight controls. But the fire had spread in such a way that it began to attack the aircraft's elevons, the control surfaces that allow the aircraft to be maneuvered. And the hydraulic circuits were also disrupted by this fire. And since everything was run using hydraulic systems, physical strength is not enough to fly a plane like that. So, without the force of the hydraulic system and without the control surfaces that were burning and falling to pieces, the aircraft became uncontrollable.
Tombé en morceaux, l'avion est devenu totalement impilotable.
If he'd been able to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the fire that he was having to deal with, he might well have decided, to hell with it, I'm going to just abandon the takeoff and take my chances, because I do not want to take the airplane into the air with this great blowtorch of flame coming out of it. But he didn't have that information available to him. So he was operating, basically correctly on the information that he had available to him.
Christian Marty struggled to pull the aircraft's nose up because he could not see any other option than to take off. There was not enough runway to abort the takeoff, but nor could he fly around and land. In 2002, the controversial final inquest report was released. Continental Airlines was initially found responsible for triggering the sequence of events that cost the lives of more than 100 people and left the survivors of Hotelissimo traumatized.
In that accident report, they blame two things. One is this piece of metal on the runway, and the other is that there were design weaknesses in Concorde. There were no design weaknesses in Concorde, in my opinion, absolutely not. The piece of metal on the runway that had been left by a Continental Airlines DC-10, a little titanium strip, that was a factor in the accident. But this was a classic aircraft accident. It was a whole lot of things that had been done wrong, that had gone wrong, And it was the cumulative effect of all these things that had gone wrong, been done wrong, that led to the final overwhelming catastrophe.
Continental Airlines consistently argued the plane was on fire before hitting the strip, but that they were being used as a scapegoat to protect France's airline industry. A French appeals court in 2012 would eventually clear the US airline of any criminal blame, but upheld the finding that Continental did bear some civil liability. The British and French members of the investigation team diverged in their analysis of what went wrong. John Hutchinson believes the plane could have been on fire already as it began its takeoff run.
32 witnesses, very credible witnesses, testified to say that there's smoke and flames coming out of the left-hand undercarriage leg at a very early stage of the takeoff run. And almost certainly this damage was caused by when the airplane went over the ledge as it transitioned on its takeoff from the bit of runway where it was being resurfaced to the bit of runway that was the correct runway surface. There would have been a slight ledge. As it went over that ledge, it triggered the left-hand undercarriage leg to sort of skew around in a bit because the spacer was missing.
The French investigation blamed the fuel tanks. All Air France and British Airways Concordes were retrofitted with fuel tank linings.
Le BE a recommandé pour la remise en service de l'avion.
The BEA recommended that before the aircraft was returned to service, the inside of the wing fuel tanks be lined with Kevlar. Kevlar stops large leaks.
Le Kevlar a pour effet d'éviter les grosses fuites.
Tires were, yet again, reinforced. There was also some criticism of the maintenance of the Air France aircraft, due to the lack of spacer on the left tire, which may have caused the machine to deviate from its course up the runway. But this was found irrelevant in the incident. Air France and Continental together paid out over $100 million in compensation to relatives.
Alors, il y a eu une transaction d'abord sur le plan civil. Il y a eu une transaction entre Air France et les victimes et les familles des victimes.
There was a civil transaction between Air France and the families of the victims that was well received by the victims, who were satisfied. And when the trial began, the British lawyer, or the victim's lawyer who was in London at the time, was interviewed by the BBC. And when asked if he was happy that the public trial was about to begin, he said, "No, because there's no point. They've been rapidly and adequately compensated, and all this trial does is to bring back their suffering."
Elles ont été rapidement et correctement indemnisées, et ce procès ne fait que raviver leur douleur.
The plane that was once an engineering achievement and the pinnacle of luxury travel is now simply a museum exhibit. It can no longer be admired on the tarmac at airports around the world, but enthusiastic visitors still flock to museums in France and Britain to get a look inside the supersonic jet that could cross the Atlantic in just 3.5 hours. An extraordinary search in the South Indian Ocean is underway. The Royal Australian Navy, coordinated by the Australian Transport Safety Board, is leading an international search for a plane that simply disappeared while on a routine flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. The Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, with 230 passengers and 9 crew aboard. There is an official hypothesis about where it crashed, but nothing has been found. Some private individuals have attempted to calculate where it might be using their own professional experience. Finding the black box is vital to establishing the truth of one of the world's most mysterious air disasters.
There is only one theory that stacks up in every way about what happened to this aircraft. This aircraft was deliberately taken wherever it's gone by somebody who knew everything about the 777.
On peut penser que les deux pilotes ont été rendus inconscients.
We might think that the pilots became unconscious after a few seconds. The plane, in fact, had a very erratic trajectory. This erratic trajectory may come from the fact that the pilots tried to find a new route, to do something. But one may have fallen unconscious before the other.
Mais l'un est peut-être tombé inconscient avant l'autre.
Nous avons fait une hypothèse puisque nous restons au niveau technique.
We have built a theory which is based on technique. And this hypothesis is that the plane and the people at the controls wanted to land safe and sound somewhere, on a landing strip, able to have them. We don't go any further, we give no political interpretation, and based on the facts that the radar and Inmarsat data gave us.
The first thing I noticed was I looked at the waypoint where the aircraft had gone missing, and I saw that it was a place quite unusual, and it was a place where all 5 different airspaces actually meet in one spot.
Everything that we know about MH370 has been pulled together by both public authorities and private individuals to get a fleeting glimpse of what might have gone wrong aboard the flight. It is the evening of the 8th of March 2014. The flight for Beijing is ready for departure. There isn't a cloud in the sky, and 153 Chinese, 38 Malaysian, and a mix of other nationalities, including 2 Italians, are preparing for their flight to China. Captain Zachary Ahmed Shah and his co-pilot, First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, are in the cockpit. They have been through security and are preparing the plane for takeoff. Neither has shown any sign of mental stress. Both have families and enjoy the prestige of flying for one of the best airlines in the world. What happened on board MH370 remains one of the great mysteries of aviation. Bernard Chabert is an internationally renowned aviation journalist and has investigated aviation accidents for the last 50 years.
Un avion en parfait état, a priori piloté par des gens sérieux, compétents, qui volent dans une compagnie aérienne qui a...
It was an aircraft in a perfect state, piloted by serious people, competent people who fly for an airline that has a good reputation, especially in Southeast Asia. An airline that's an example, an old airline, a traditional one that knows what it's doing. The flight takes off around midnight. The weather's good. There's nothing special. It's not a long flight either, several hours. A flight to China that crosses airspaces that are not dangerous either weather-wise or geopolitically.
A priori, pas dangereux sur le plan météo, sur le plan géopolitique. Bon.
In the initial report presented by the Malaysian government, the exact route followed by MH370 is accurately traced. But understanding the sequence of events, even partially, was not easy. The flight took off at 0042 Malaysian time, or 1642 Coordinated Universal Time, the time measure used by the investigation. It rapidly rose to 35,000 feet, or 10,500 meters, and headed directly for Beijing.
We are ready, requesting flight level 340 to Beijing.
The flight was due to last approximately 5 hours. Just after 1:20 a.m., the aircraft left an area of Singapore's air traffic responsibility delegated to Malaysia, at a waypoint known as Eschede. As he entered the Ho Chi Minh air traffic control area, Zachary Ahmed Shah said goodnight to Malaysian air traffic control.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
David Learmount is a civil airlines expert for Flight International magazine.
A whole lot of simple things happened in a few moments, just as the aircraft's captain called Kuala Lumpur Control and said good night, and was told to call Ho Chi Minh City Air Traffic Control. He then, the transponder on the aircraft went off, okay? So let's say one of the pilots turned the transponder off so it could no longer be seen by Kuala Lumpur. And they would have thought, that's a bit odd, but he's talking to Ho Chi Minh City. But of course he didn't call Ho Chi Minh City. What he did do was he turned quite sharply to the left.
MH370 disappeared from the air traffic control radar that traces the signals sent out by the aircraft's transponder with its individual call sign. Former Eurocontrol project manager and member of the CAPTIO group of investigators into the mystery, Jean-Luc Marchand, understands exactly what this means.
You have to understand what was going on in the mind of the air traffic controller. Kuala Lumpur had said goodbye to the aircraft, which means that in his mental procedure, he was no longer under my control. I asked you to manually make radio contact with Ho Chi Minh. It is an old-fashioned manual process. It is the aircraft that takes the initiative, not the air traffic controller, which explains the reaction time. So the Malaysian controller thinks, that's it, I'm done. This aircraft is no longer with me. So he concentrates, and that night he concentrated on 4 aircrafts that were flying in the southwest quadrant that maybe weren't going to meet, but required his attention. And for him, the Malaysian 370 was out of his control area.
The civilian air traffic control services lost sight of the aircraft because they rely on what's known as secondary surveillance radar. Basically, their radar sends out an interrogation signal, and a transponder on the airplane answers it and says, I'm here and this is me, identification. If you switch off the transponder on the airplane, nothing comes back, so air traffic control loses sight of it.
Other automatic and voluntary communications systems exist also. The aircraft captain will change VHF radio frequencies as he or she enters a new air traffic control airspace to be able to communicate with the new controllers on the ground. The aircraft also signals its status directly to the airline. The system is called Aircraft Communication Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS.
L'ACARS, c'est un système d'autodiagnostic de l'avion, je résume un peu.
ACARS is an auto-diagnostic system of the aircraft, a system by which the aircraft self-diagnoses and is able at predetermined intervals to automatically send a status report saying, I'm here, I'm going there, I'm flying at this speed, engine temperatures are this, and a mass of data as requested, as required by the airline and the owner of the aircraft, who decide how they want to follow the aircraft and how often, and so forth. So the aircraft sends data that shows the state of the plane constantly.
C'est presque à la demande, on fait à peu près ce qu'on veut. On envoie des données qui font que l'avion s'autodiagnostique en permanence.
A third navigation system contacts the navigation satellite Inmarsat and, depending on the package the airline has bought from the satellite company, can identify the exact position of the plane.
Le système qui passe par le réseau satellite Inmarsat est un système de relais de communication. Une station.
The Inmarsat satellite system is a system of communications relays that are emitted by stations in the air, on the ground, on the sea. They are signals that can be received within a certain range of the transmitter. But if this transmitter contacts the satellite, and the satellite can send the same signal to another satellite, the signal can be received anywhere you want on Earth.
Il y a un autre satellite, et ainsi le signal peut être pratiquement distribué où on a envie de le distribuer sur Terre.
At 1:20 hours local time on the 8th of March 2014, all these communications ceased to function. By the next morning, the aircraft was declared lost. It never landed in Beijing. Hundreds of distraught relatives would be left without answers.
With the heaviest heart and deepest sorrow that, on behalf of the government of Malaysia, we officially declare Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 an accident, and that all 239 of the passengers and crew on board MH370 are presumed to have lost their lives.
This aircraft didn't disappear in one click. It disappeared over a couple of hours, okay? It was being watched. The military, who use other forms of radar, mainly primary radar, they did not lose sight of it. They were watching it for some time, and they watched the aircraft virtually do a 180-degree turn and fly along a line precisely between two areas of air traffic control responsibility, that's Vietnam's and Kuala Lumpur's responsibility, so that each side thought the other side had responsibility and nobody questioned what was going on.
It was the beginning of one of the most tragic aviation mysteries of all time. Had the aircraft crashed into the South China Sea? It took a week for the Malaysian Air Force to volunteer the information that MH370 had been tracked by military radar. In fact, the flight flew right over Penang and northwestwards out over the Andaman Sea before disappearing. What could possibly have happened aboard?
Les militaires, s'ils surveillaient bien, et ils ont dit qu'ils avaient vu effectivement l'avion.
The military, if they had been watching and they said they had seen the plane, at that point could not understand that the four segments they had seen on their radar and their echo radar were the same aircraft. Only a person could make that connection. And if the controller did, then, as he said in his report, he did not consider the aircraft as a threat. And rightly and cleverly, the aircraft flew along the frontier between Thailand and Malaysia, making each side think that it was under the other's control.
Thaïlandais et malaisien que c'était l'autre qui contrôlait.
One of the people determined to find the plane is Simon Hardy, himself a Boeing 777 pilot and instructor.
It was only when the first report came out saying that they had really no way of finding where it was that I became interested. And the first thing I noticed was I looked at the waypoint where the aircraft had gone missing, and I saw that it was a place quite unusual, and it was a place where all 5 different airspaces actually meet in one spot.
6 weeks after the aircraft disappeared, the satellite company Inmarsat was able to come forward with information of its own. The aircraft's Inmarsat receiver contacted the Indian Ocean satellite 7 times, beginning at 2:25 local time, an hour after the aircraft had disappeared, signaling that the system was booting up, proving that it had been turned off beforehand.
Our interpretation is that when the aircraft's electricity was cut off, or that someone aboard turned off the electricity, there are 2 ways. There's the electronic bay, that is under the cockpit, that someone could have got into on the ground and stayed there during the flight, as it's pressurized, heated, habitable, and decide to open the main electricity disjunctors that turns the electricity off. What happens? The RAT, or a turbine, a little windmill, is deployed from the aircraft and produces a small amount of electricity, but enough to fly the plane, and enough hydraulics to activate the controls.
The system sent out an interrogation, that is, the satellite sent out an interrogation from time to time and got a vestigial response. It wasn't a response that contained much detail, but geometrically the satellite could work out where, at what range from the satellite that aircraft was. Now, the range means it's anywhere on a big circle. Those signals enabled people who understand navigation and mathematics to work out where the aircraft must have gone.
Your GPS in your car finds 3 satellites, and it doesn't know where you are, your GPS. It knows how far you are from that satellite, and it also knows the distance to that one and the distance to that one. So in its brain, in your GPS, it then draws 3 circles, and where they intersect is your position, and then it puts it on a map. So in this way, we've got, if you look at these 7 circles, they're the sort of GPS distance circles, but we've only got 1 satellite. We haven't got the 3, so there's no intersection of 3 lines to show you where you are. You've just got a circle, and you're somewhere on that enormous circle.
The satellite provided 2 types of information. The burst time offset is the time it takes for a signal to leave the ground station and reach the aircraft via the satellite, which gives an arc of possible locations. Another set of data, burst frequency offset, is derived from the difference between expected and real speed of delivery of the return signal, which varies due to a Doppler effect caused by the plane's and the satellite's movement.
For each Inmarsat signal, we have 2 values, the BTO and the BFO. The first gives us a position on a sphere that isn't necessarily the terrestrial globe, as it is also in altitude. The second gives us an indication of the movement of the plane at that moment in time. Is it climbing or descending? How come? Because the aircraft has a system of frequency compensation that compensates the Doppler effect, that is imperfect, and this error tells us whether the aircraft was climbing or descending, and whether it was approaching or distancing itself from the satellite.
The 7 concentric rings produced by the Inmarsat satellite tell us MH370 was somewhere on the circumference, but do not tell us the direction it was flying in. However, the BPO values did help identify the route and the altitude.
La sortie des radars malaisiens montre une précision.
The Malaysian radar signal shows an extremely calm, precise execution of the flight, and the turn off course shows that the pilots were professional and executed it manually, and clearly were not panicking. They turned the electricity back on when they needed to, but they had plenty of time, because the maneuvers were every half an hour. Their aircraft can't descend by itself. Someone has to enter a new altitude. An aircraft will always remain at the same altitude unless there is a human intervention.
In the meantime, a number of safety issues were coming to light, together with various theories as to what might have happened on board. 2 travelers on Italian passports were found to be Iranian refugees who presented false passports. But the hijacking thesis was quickly discarded when the 2 Iranians were identified. However, another terrifying hypothesis came to light.
On croit savoir qu'il y avait une caisse contenant autour de 200 kg, peut-être un peu plus, 240 kg, de batteries au lithium-ion qui a été
We think that there was a case containing 200 kilos, maybe 240 kilos of lithium-ion batteries loaded aboard this aircraft. Let's imagine that this crate was loaded into the front cargo bay. When you go into a 777 cargo bay, which is a high ceiling space, almost as high as here, you're in a room, a long room that's several, maybe 6 meters wide. And in front of this room and under the cockpit, there's a bulwark that separates the cargo bay from the electronics bay.
Sous le poste de pilotage, il y a une cloison qui sépare la soute de ce qu'on appelle la soute électronique.
The communications bay of the Boeing 777 is separated from the cargo bay by a thin bulwark and a door. If the lithium-ion batteries had been loaded against the bulwark, any explosion would have cut through the separating wall and the communications bay, releasing toxic gases directly into the air conditioning. This might have knocked out the crew and passengers, leaving only the pilot enough time to don his oxygen mask.
Et lorsqu'on a un incendie d'une batterie lithium-ion, ça produit une boule de flamme, un flash.
When a lithium battery burns, it produces a fireball, a flash that burns out very fast, that doesn't burn very long. A real flash that releases an enormous heat, that releases mortal gases very quickly.
Et également qui dégage des vapeurs qui sont absolument mortelles rapidement.
Without communications and struggling to find somewhere to land, the fainting pilot could have headed for the closest airfield, missed it, and turned back before losing consciousness.
Quelle va être la première réaction d'un équipage qui se voit soudain envahi de fumée?
What will be the first reaction of a crew that is swamped by fumes and realizes that they're dangerous fumes? They put on their masks. They try to communicate to alert someone. And the first thing they do is to turn towards the closest emergency landing strip. The aircraft did, in fact, according to the presumed radar trace, the aircraft did turn towards an airport that could have worked as an emergency airport in case of a catastrophic problem aboard. So the aircraft did in fact follow an erratic route, and this erratic route could have been due to the fact that the pilots tried to find a new route to do something, but one might have fallen unconscious before the other.
Quelque chose, mais l'un est peut-être tombé inconscient avant l'autre.
Two other lithium battery-related incidents in the past decade suggest that this is a possibility. Flight UPS-9 from Dubai crash-landed in the desert after the pilots signaled a fire aboard provoked by lithium batteries. However, the fire was so catastrophic that the aircraft crashed.
Et il y a eu deux accidents de 747 cargos. L'un a eu lieu au Moyen-Orient et l'autre en Extrême-Orient.
There have been two accidents involving 747 cargoes, one in the Middle East and the other in the Far East, over the Pacific, a short time after takeoff. In the case of the Middle Eastern accident, the flight lasted just a few minutes. The captain, it seems, had left his seat in the cockpit full of fumes to go and get a mask because his wasn't functioning. But the co-pilot, on the other hand, who was equipped with a mask, said just before the aircraft crashed that he couldn't even see the instruments. Such was the smoke in the cockpit.
Qu'il ne voyait même plus les instruments tellement il y avait de fumée dans le poste de pilotage.
The supposed fire didn't bring the aircraft down, unusual, and two, didn't cut off the communications, very unusual. So it's something that you wouldn't expect. And the aircraft was still flying, and we can still see it on the military radar. It was still flying very successfully as it goes around Penang. So the time between the fire and somebody not controlling the aircraft is quite long. If there's a fire, you do want to get the aircraft on the ground as soon as possible, land as soon as possible is what the checklist says.
It's someone in the cockpit who, on the upper control panel above the pilot's head, can press 4 or 5 buttons to open the circuits, like the disjunctors, that are simple pressure buttons. He presses and turns off the generators, the two main ones, one in each engine, plus the backup, plus the turbine that you hear when you go aboard an aircraft. You hear the turbine at the back of the aircraft that supplies power to the aircraft at times, and the fifth generator. If you turn off all 5, then the RAT is deployed automatically.
The investigation brought to light another disturbing fact. Pilot Zahari Ahmed Shah had mapped a route to the South Indian Ocean on his personal computer simulator. Why?
Le copilote était un jeune homme qui était en train de démarrer brillamment une carrière de pilote de ligne.
The co-pilot was a young man who was beginning a brilliant career as an airline pilot, which isn't the worst job in the world. As for the captain, he had a great career, and although he was like anyone else with his ideas, with a life, but he showed no signs of mental stress, unlike other crashes caused by suicide of the pilot that could have been foreseen or were foreseeable. While here there's nothing that could indicate that there was a deliberate decision on the part of a crew member.
Suicide qui, dans tous ces cas précédents, aurait pu être prévu, était prévisible. Tandis que là, non, il n'y a rien qui semble indiquer qu'on ait eu une volonté délibérée d'un membre d'équipage.
We know that this aircraft must have been directed for the time that it was watched by military radar. It must have been directed by somebody who knew how to fly the aircraft and how to navigate it and how to operate its systems. So we're probably talking about a pilot. There were only 2 pilots on board. We don't know if this was a deliberate act. We don't know the precise motivation for it, but it might have been revenge against Malaysia, against the airline, against the employer, against the government. You've got a huge device with Malaysia written down the side of it. If you want to get your own back on something Malaysian, making that airplane disappear might be rather a good way of doing it.
However, speculation on the reasons for the loss of MH370 will only be fully dispelled once the black box, or flight data recorder, has been found. As the world puzzled over what had happened to MH370 with 230 people aboard, a number of new details came to light. The first officer's telephone was on, and a signal had been picked up at 2:31 hours as the aircraft flew around Penang Island. No other telephones were picked up, and yet there were hundreds of phones on the aircraft. What had happened to the passengers and crew? The aircraft followed a route that only a very able pilot could have managed, according to Jean-Luc Marchand. 2 other aircraft were flying along the flight path MH370 was on, so the pilot took evasive action.
Et donc, il s'est débrouillé pour retrouver...
He managed to find this route after leaving Penang. It was an air lane that runs from Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, towards the Middle East and Europe, and which was quite active, which planes were flying along. And that night, as he left the radar coverage, he was followed by an Emirates flight about 20 nautical miles behind his left shoulder. And in front of him, he had a flight that had left half an hour earlier from Madras, from Chennai, which was on Indigo, and which was flying about the same altitude. So he had 2 planes flying more or less at his altitude, and he wanted to take a left turn. And to avoid them, he carried out a contingency procedure, which involves shifting right by 15 nautical miles and then descending to pass under the airlane.
The aircraft went to great lengths not to alert air forces by flying along non-threatening routes and as far away as possible from known radar ranges. But if the plane flew south, where did it end up?
Nous avons fait l'hypothèse.
We hypothesized that the pilot, or whoever was at the controls, respected the structure of airspace and the lanes. And keeping that in mind, we deduced the potential and possible actions of the aircraft at each key moment. And thanks to the measurements, we identified the direction and the altitude of flight from the Inmarsat data. So we interpreted the data to find the trajectory, and this gave us a trajectory that was descending between 1825 and 1840, before turning south to fly under the air lanes, remaining at altitude 270, to go around the secondary radar of Sebang, and then he flew south, so changed heading, and then he flew under 2 air lanes that are lower.
Calmement est descendu pour passer sur 2 routes qui sont plus basses.
On the other hand, Simon Hardy does not believe the plane flew low, but rather tried to get as far away as possible. So he concentrated on the last 3 arcs on which the aircraft was located, while still communicating with Inmarsat.
There's 7 pings, 7 circles, 7 range circles, which have to be solved. The first one, and the last one, is the aircraft being repowered, or the satellite unit, the satellite data unit on the aircraft being repowered, and it's saying to the satellite, I'm starting up after having been off. The other ones is a periodic inquiry from the satellite to the aircraft saying, are you still turned on? So that's why these arcs are an hour apart from one, which is the ones I use later, is an hour and a half apart, because there's a telephone call that comes in at the moment when it would have been sending the inquiry, the hourly inquiry.
The information Simon Hardy was looking for was direction and speed values that were compatible with the plane taking an hour to fly between the 5th and 6th arc and 90 minutes between the 6th and 7th.
Most of my lines, when I drew them on this big map here, were pretty much parallel. I didn't know which one was correct, but I was finding something out. I was finding out that the track of the aircraft during those 2.5 hours was somewhere between 188 degrees and 192 degrees.
Now Simon had to find the speed.
The aircraft has to fly down from up near the tip of Sumatra. It has to get to these various points on the last section, has to get there. And so what I did then was say, okay, the distance from there to there, or the time from there to there, is 3 hours and 5 minutes. It has to get there, so what's the speed of it from there to there? One of these lines will be no speed change between the 3 hours and 5 minutes and the next bit, which is drawn down here. So then that was the next process was, okay, what is the constant speed line of all these lines, and they're crossing over and nicely in the opposite direction. So which is the constant speed line? So I did my calculations, I found the constant speed line, which was 488 knots.
The constant speed line that connected the distance between the 5th and 6th arc and the 6th and 7th indicated a speed that Simon had seen often.
Unlike a car, and in cruise, an aircraft goes pretty much at the same speed day in, day out. And so for the last 15 years, I've been seeing 488 knots in front of me as I'm in cruise on my 777. So the fact that it was telling me the constant speed line is 488 knots, that's astounding. That tells me not only that I'm making progress, but maybe the aircraft that made this line was a 777 rather than a 737.
If the aircraft was flying at 488 knots along those lines, what course would it have taken to reach the place it disappeared from radar coverage in 3 hours and 5 minutes from its last sighting?
So at that point, I then transferred from this map, where you can't see, this is a long way away from the tip of Sumatra. So I then transferred my affections onto Google Maps, drew the little line down here, which is the 488 between 4, 5 and 6, and joined it up the 3 hours, 5 minutes to see what the difference in the angle was. Well, there wasn't a difference in the angle. It's a straight line. That was the second part where I'd say, oh goodness, I'm onto something here.
Plus votre vol en moyenne va être lent, plus l'avion...
The slower the plane flies, the more its route will curve to the east, so it will end up further north than the areas searched, that were searched assuming a straight line. If you assume a high speed, then the straighter the line and the more it will take a southerly route. It's inevitable. In our case, our trajectory is descending, bit by bit, so the speed of the plane is slower and slower. That's inevitable. So our trajectory aims towards Christmas Island. Other groups, such as the ATSB, for example, say that they think it flew at a constant speed. Because at that altitude, you need to fly relatively fast to fly at all. So, inevitably, their heading is much more southerly.
Et ben donc, du coup, leur trajectoire est beaucoup plus au sud.
That little line down here in the southern Eschede could have been pointing at Bali or India or anywhere, but it wasn't. It was pointing directly at the place where the aircraft turned south.
However, it is the last part of the route that is so difficult to estimate. The Inmarsat transmitter was rebooted, but never told the satellite it was ready. At some time within those 3 minutes, the aircraft was no longer flying. The Royal Australian Navy and the Malaysian government joined forces to search for the aircraft and launched the most expensive search and rescue operation of all time. The resources placed at the disposal of the operation were impressive, but the size of the area was also awe-inspiring. More than 1 million square kilometers of empty ocean. The search continued for 4 years, and then the private oil prospecting company Ocean Infinity offered a success fee deal to find the plane. These two campaigns also drew a blank. Once Simon Hardy was able to establish the route and the distance, it was a logical step to estimate the location of the aircraft.
Where that 188 degrees crosses the last beep is the place to say, okay, the aircraft passed over the 7th arc here. That is not where they've searched there, but I've always said, that's not a place to search. Where the 7th arc is where the aircraft is saying, it's another indication that the satellite unit is working. It's actually a start-up again. But it's saying Windows starting. So it's working. So the 7th arc, all these complicated things inside the aircraft are working. It hasn't been smashed into 1,000 pieces.
The Inmarsat transmitter was rebooted because it had been turned off beforehand, possibly because the engines no longer provided electrical power. It never sent a message to say it was ready. In those 3 minutes, the aircraft was no longer flying. By creating a flight plan based on the actual route followed by the aircraft and the presumed route to the South Indian Ocean, Simon Hardy was able to find 3 parameters that indicate where the plane should be.
As a 777 pilot, I was able to use a professional flight plan for the known part of the flight, which you can see for about the first hour, up to when it disappears off the edge of the radar at 1822 forever. So that's all absolutely correct. And then after that, I have to add in a little bit up to the turn south, and then the turn south on 188 straight. And then I can also draw another circle of where it runs out of fuel. So I've got 2 circles, I've got 2 lines, 188, 7th arc, and now I've got another arc, which is the range circle. So those all cross in almost the same place. They cross in about 27 nautical miles from each other, which is, again, that's extraordinary. I couldn't make it up.
According to this theory, pilot Zahari Ahmad Shah was alive and piloting for the whole period of the flight, from where it disappeared off the radar screens to its final descent. It is a terrifying idea. The French former Eurocontrol expert has a different theory.
We don't know how whoever was in control actually introduced the data into the flight computer to indicate the next point. Did they introduce a flight plan, or did they do it point by point? So if it was a flight plan and they had indicated Christmas Island, we have to take into account that the predictions of the flight computer are not perfectly precise, and it gets more accurate as it draws closer to the destination. Our flight simulator continued to tell us that we had enough fuel to get there, up to 200 nautical miles beforehand, and then, as we drew closer, told us we wouldn't make it.
How could the pilot have got away with it? There was a crew and there was a co-pilot.
The most obvious way to disable the passengers would be to do a depressurization, which can easily be organised. We have switches to prevent it. So it's usually done by the aircraft, is automatically doing pressurization. But if that goes wrong, we have some switches. You can go to manual opening of outflow valves. There's big, about this size, outflow valves on the side of the aircraft, one at the front, one at the back, and we can manually control them. So if you wanted to do a depressurization for some reason, you can do it. As the pilot, you have full control over the aircraft. So that would be the easiest way to disable the passengers and the crew.
One of the reasons Simon Hardy is so convinced that the aircraft was deliberately taken off course is a strange maneuver it carried out over the island of Penang.
The aircraft does a strange turn around Penang. That was another one. It took me months to think about that one, in that it doesn't go directly over the airport. So I was thinking, why is it staying away? It's staying a few miles away, but it does a very shallow turn all the way round the southern waters of the island. And then after a while, I remembered that I'd done this sort of manoeuvre myself when I wanted to look at something. It was Ayers Rock. So I want to look at something. So I thought, oh, somebody's looking out the window. Somebody's looking at something. And so that's when I came down here, and I typed in where the crew from. Where's the first officer from? It's from Selangor. Where's the captain from? He's from the island of Penang.
We think that the aircraft was controlled right to the end, and despite having no engines, the pilot tried to ditch the plane. Why? Because there is so little debris on the surface that has been recovered, and the nature of the debris and the way it has broken suggests to us that it was a ditching.
Study of the ocean currents suggests that MH370 really did crash land in the southern Indian Ocean. One part in particular is of interest. It is the left flaperon, and it suggests that the pilot tried to ditch the plane smoothly on water rather than crashing it vertically. The flaperon, found in Réunion, was eroded along the trailing edge, damage that can only have been produced if it had been extended for landing. An event that was spectacularly achieved on the Hudson River in 2017 by Chesley Burnett Sullenberger.
We took a look at all the depressions that crossed the potential path of the debris, and there were about 15, of which one was very important, and that is Gillian. Just a few days after the crash, and that's determining because it took the debris very far south for several days, and then pushed them westwards, which makes the point that we have found as the aircraft's crash site plausible. So we projected this debris and saw where they would land, and in fact the data suggested La Réunion Island over the times observed, and the coast of Madagascar and Africa over the same time.
Simon Hardy's calculations did not end with an approximate place of ditching. He continued to look at the data available and at the area where he thinks the plane might be.
When I started drawing the final resting place of the aircraft, which ends up with the shape of a piece of cheese, I saw that there was a dark line running through this piece of cheese from the tip of it to the curved edge, running right through it like a spine through it. And I had no idea what that was, but it's another coincidence. So I then looked it up, and it's called the Hale-Vinch Fracture Zone. It's a big trench. It's 4,500 meters deep. It has seismic activity. As somebody who was planning to make an aircraft disappear, if that's what's happened, this would be an ideal place to put it.
According to some reports, there is a final twist in the story of MH370. Shah received a telephone call on his own cell phone half an hour before takeoff. It was made from a phone using a SIM card that had been bought by a woman using a false identity. However, the telephone that used that SIM card has been identified, but that identity has not been released by the Malaysian government, nor where the telephone call was made from. The SIM card made that one single telephone call. Who made it and what was said will never be known, even in this day and age of high-tech and ubiquitous personal information, nor will the reason why one of the largest and most sophisticated aircraft available today disappeared over the most remote area of the Earth. The mystery will continue, unless the aircraft is found and its flight data recorder retrieved, as the relatives of the 230 passengers and crew aboard MH370 earnestly hope.